Tonight, I find myself remembering those post-war years when America looked up at its skies with new uncertainty. The way afternoon heat shimmered off military airfields across the country, and how the steady rhythm of bureaucratic procedure began to shape our understanding of the unexplained. This is the story of Project Blue Book, not as science fiction, but as institutional history, unhurried and complex. If this quiet approach to government archives and classified documents helps you unwind, a like would mean a lot. Subscribe if you'd like to join me for more slow journeys through the corridors of official secrecy. Tell me in the comments where tonight finds you listening, and what draws you to these stories of bureaucrats wrestling with the impossible. Dim the lights. Let's drift back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where filing cabinets held America's strangest mysteries. I remember the summer of 1947, when the air itself seemed charged with possibility and unease. The war had been over for 2 years, but America still carried the restless energy of a nation that had learned to scan its skies for threats. Back then, on clear afternoons, you could hear the drone of aircraft engines drifting across wheat fields and suburban neighborhoods, a constant reminder that the age of flight had truly begun. The smell of aviation fuel lingered at small airports from coast to coast, mixing with the dust of unpaved runways and the metallic temps of aluminum that had become the backbone of American industry. It was into this atmosphere that Kenneth Arnold flew his Cala A2 on the 24th of June. Somewhere over the Cascade Mountains of Washington State, Arnold, a businessman, an experienced pilot from Idaho, had been searching for a missing marine transport aircraft when something caught his eye near Mount Rainier. The mountain itself stood massive against the afternoon sky, its snow-covered peak catching the light in ways that made distant objects seem to shimmer and dance. But what Arnold saw was different 9 objects moving in formation, their surfaces reflecting the sun like polished metal. I can imagine the steady vibration of his aircraft's engine, the familiar hum that every pilot knows by heart, suddenly seeming less reliable as he watched these impossible shapes streak across his field of vision. Arnold later estimated their speed at over 1,000 miles per hour, far exceeding anything that existed in 1947. The fastest military jets of the time could barely reach half that velocity, and most civilian aircraft still relied on propellers that would have torn apart at such speeds. What fascinated Arnold most was not just their speed, but their peculiar method of flight. He described them as moving like saucers skipping across water, a comparison that would prove more consequential than he could have imagined. The objects seemed to dip and rise in unison, maintaining their formation while following the contours of the mountain ridges below. There was something almost playful about their movement, as if they were dancing with the landscape rather than simply traversing it. When Arnold landed in Yakima, Washington, the tarmac was still warm from the afternoon sun, and the air carried that particular stillness that comes just before evening. He spoke casually to other pilots about what he had seen, expecting perhaps mild interest or suggestions about atmospheric phenomena he might have witnessed. Instead, his account spread through the small aviation community with surprising speed. By the time he reached his final destination in Pendleton, Oregon, reporters were already waiting. The press had latched onto Arnold's description, but somewhere in the translation from his words to newsprint, flying like saucers became flying saucers. This linguistic accident would prove to be one of the most significant misquotations in modern history. The term captured something essential about the mystery. These objects were not behaving like conventional aircraft, and they demanded a new vocabulary to describe them. Within days of Arnold's report, the phenomenon exploded across the American consciousness. Newspapers from small towns to major cities picked up the story, and suddenly everyone was looking up. The summer sky, which had always been a canvas of clouds and familiar aircraft, became a stage for possibility. Reports began flooding in from across the nation. Farmers in Iowa claiming to see metallic discs over their cornfields, factory workers in Detroit spotting formations of strange objects during their lunch breaks, children in suburban neighborhoods running inside to tell their parents about the silver things they had seen dancing between the clouds. The speed of this cultural contagion was remarkable, even by the standards of an increasingly connected world. Radio stations devoted entire programs to collecting listener reports, and newspapers ran daily tallies of new sightings. Conservative estimates placed the number of reports in the hundreds within the first few weeks, though some sources suggested thousands of Americans had looked up and seen something they could not readily explain. This was the birth of what historians would later call the flying disc craze. But at the time, it felt more like a national awakening to mysteries that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. The objects themselves, whether real or imagined, seemed to prefer clear skies and open spaces. They were reported most frequently during daylight hours, often in the late afternoon, when the angle of the sun created optimal conditions for spotting reflective surfaces against the blue backdrop of the sky. Just 2 weeks after Arnold's initial sighting, the phenomenon took on an even more dramatic dimension near the small town of Roswell, New Mexico. The desert landscape around Roswell was harsh and unforgiving, a place where the sun beat down mercilessly during the day and the temperature dropped sharply after sunset. It was ranch country, where men like William Mack Brazel spent their days checking fences and water supplies across vast stretches of scrubland punctuated by mesquite and tumbleweeds. On the morning of July 8th, Major Jesse Marcel, an intelligence officer from the Roswell Army Airfield, found himself examining strange debris that Brazel had discovered scattered across his property. The material was unlike anything Marcel had encountered in his military career, lightweight, yet incredibly strong, with properties that seemed to defy conventional understanding of metallurgy. Some pieces bore strange markings that resembled hieroglyphics, while others had a mirror-like finish that reflected light in unusual ways. The initial military response was swift and, in retrospect, remarkably candid. Colonel William Blanchard, the base commander, authorized a press release that afternoon announcing the recovery of a flying disc. The statement was brief and matter-of-fact, delivered with the kind of bureaucratic precision that characterized military communications of the era. For a few hours, it seemed as though the mystery of the flying saucers had found its resolution. The military had recovered one of the objects that had captured the nation's imagination. But by the following morning, the story had changed completely. General Roger Remy Blanchard's superior held a press conference at 8th Air Force Headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. The room was filled with the harsh lighting and cigarette smoke that characterized military briefings of the 1940s. Ramey displayed what he claimed were the actual debris from the Brazel ranch, fragments of a weather balloon and its radar reflector, mundane materials that bore little resemblance to the exotic descriptions that had circulated the previous day. The assembled reporters photographed the conventional wreckage, and Ramey explained that the initial excitement had been the result of an overreacher intelligence officer mistakenly identifying routine meteorological equipment. Major Marcel, who had been so certain of the material's unusual properties just hours before, stood silently as his superior dismissed the entire incident as a case of mistaken identity. This swift reversal created something unprecedented in the relationship between the American government and its citizens. For the first time in the modern era, a significant portion of the public had witnessed a clear demonstration that military officials were willing to present fundamentally different versions of the same event within the span of 24 hours. The implications were profound and lasting. The truth, as would be revealed decades later, was that both versions contained elements of deception. The debris was indeed from a classified military project, but it was not a conventional weather balloon. Project Mogul was one of the most sensitive operations of the early Cold War, designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests through high-altitude acoustic monitoring. The materials recovered from the Brazil Ranch were from one of these experimental devices, equipped with specialized sensors and reflectors that gave them their unusual properties. General Ramey's weather balloon explanation was a carefully crafted cover story, designed to protect national security without completely abandoning the realm of plausibility. But the very act of providing a demonstrably false explanation of a legitimate security reasons established a pattern that would haunt government credibility for generations to come. Citizens who had witnessed the initial announcement and the subsequent retraction were left with the inescapable conclusion that military authorities would lie when it served their purposes. This realization created fertile ground for what would become one of the most persistent conspiracy theories in American history. If the government was willing to fabricate explanations for debris found in the New Mexico desert, what other deceptions might be hidden beneath the surface of official statements? The Roswell incident became the foundational narrative for those who believed that authorities were systematically concealing evidence of extraterrestrial visitation. As summer turned to autumn in 1947, the immediate frenzy of flying saucer reports began to subside, but the questions they raised remained unanswered. The military, which had initially approached the phenomenon with a mixture of curiosity and concern, found itself grappling with broader implications for national security and public confidence. The objects themselves, whatever they might have been, had demonstrated an ability to generate widespread attention and speculation that extended far beyond their physical presence in the sky. The summer of flying discs marked the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between American citizens and their government, one characterized by mutual suspicion and competing versions of reality. The clear skies of June and July had given way to the complex atmospheric conditions of an emerging Cold War, where truth itself became a strategic resource to be carefully managed and deployed. In the offices of the Pentagon and the corridors of the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, officials began to recognize that the flying saucer phenomenon represented something more than simple misidentification of conventional aircraft. Whether the objects were real or imagined, they had demonstrated their power to capture public attention, generate media coverage, and create the kind of mass excitement that could potentially be exploited by foreign adversaries. As 1947 drew to a close, the stage was set for a more systematic approach to understanding and controlling the narrative surrounding unidentified flying objects. The age of casual dismissal was ending, and the era of organized investigation was about to begin. The summer of flying discs had opened a door that would prove impossible to close, leading inexorably toward the creation of the most extensive government study of unexplained aerial phenomena in American history. The warmth of that summer lingered in memory long after the seasons changed, carrying with it the particular quality of uncertainty that comes when the familiar world reveals unexpected possibilities. Those who had looked up and seen something extraordinary would never quite view the sky in the same way again, and neither would the institutions tasked with protecting the nation's security and maintaining public confidence in official explanations. Back then, before the machinery of investigation and analysis took hold, there was something pure about the mystery itself, filtered by bureaucratic processing or official interpretation. The objects, whatever they were, had appeared against the backdrop of an America still learning to live with its new role as a global superpower, still adjusting to technologies that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. In that context, perhaps it was inevitable that the skies themselves would become a theater for the impossible, a place where the boundaries between reality and imagination grew thin enough for something genuinely unprecedented to break through. I remember the offices in the Pentagon during those early months of 1948, when the morning light filtered through tall windows and cast long shadows across polished corridors that still smelled faintly of fresh paint and institutional disinfectant. The building itself was barely 6 years old then, its concrete walls holding the accumulated tension of a nation learning to maintain perpetual military readiness. In those sterile hallways where the sound of footsteps echoed with particular sharpness, senior officers were beginning to wrestle with a problem that defied conventional military analysis. The flying saucer reports had not disappeared with the changing seasons. If anything, they had evolved into something more persistent and troubling. What had begun as a summer curiosity was revealing itself to be a phenomenon that crossed geographical boundaries, appeared at all hours of the day and night, and seemed to demonstrate flight characteristics that challenged the fundamental assumptions of aeronautical engineering. More concerning still, many of the most credible reports were coming from within the military itself. Pilots, radar operators, and ground personnel whose training and experience made casual dismissal increasingly difficult. General Nathan Twining, who commanded the Air Technical Service Command at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, found himself at the center of these mounting concerns. Twining was a methodical man, accustomed to dealing with concrete problems that yielded to systematic analysis. His office at Wright-Patterson overlooked the vast expanse of runways and hangars where America's most advanced aircraft were tested and refined. The base itself hummed with the constant activity of engineers and technicians pushing the boundaries of flight. But even these experts were struggling to explain reports that seemed to describe capabilities decades ahead of current technology. The decision to establish a formal investigation came after months of informal discussions and memoranda that circulated through the highest levels of military command. I can imagine those documents moving through the bureaucratic machinery of the early Air Force, each bearing the distinctive stamps and signatures that marked their passage from desk to desk. The paper itself would have been that particular weight and texture that government officers favored, substantial enough to convey importance, but economical enough for mass distribution. In January of 1948, Twining authorized the creation of Project SIGN, initially designated as Project Saucer, before military preference for more neutral terminology prevailed. The project was housed at Wright-Patterson in a complex of low buildings where the afternoon Ohio wind rattled windows and carried the scent of aviation fuel from the flight line. The offices assigned to SIGN were Spartan affairs, furnished with government tissue desks and filing cabinets, fluorescent lights that cast everything in a slightly greenish hue, and walls painted in that particular shade of institutional green that seemed designed to discourage prolonged contemplation. The mission statement for Project SIGN reflected the military's attempt to approach the phenomenon with scientific rigor, while maintaining operational security. The project was tasked to collect, collate, evaluate, and distribute within the government all information relating to such sightings. This bureaucratic language masked what was actually a remarkable admission. The United States Air Force was officially acknowledging that unidentified objects were operating in American airspace with apparent impunity, demonstrating flight characteristics that exceeded known technology. The personnel assigned to Project SIGN brought diverse backgrounds to their unusual assignment. They were intelligence officers accustomed to analyzing foreign military capabilities, engineers familiar with the cutting edge of American aviation technology, and scientists whose expertise in atmospheric physics and astronomy might help explain sightings that others found baffling. These men, and they were almost exclusively men in that era, found themselves occupying a unique position in the military hierarchy, tasked with investigating phenomena that existed at the intersection of national security and scientific mystery. The work itself was methodical and often tedious. Reports arrived through various channels. Military personnel filed formal accounts through the chain of command, while civilian sightings were forwarded by local law enforcement or collected through media outlets. Each account required careful documentation, witness interviews when possible, and analysis of weather conditions, astronomical events, and military or civilian air traffic that might explain the observations. The filing systems that emerged during this period reflected the military's attempt to impose order on inherently chaotic data. Cases were assigned numbers, witness statements were transcribed onto standardized forms, and photographic evidence was catalogued with the same attention to detail that characterized the storage of classified weapons specifications. The cabinets themselves were locked each evening, their contents accessible only to personnel with appropriate security clearances. As the months passed, certain patterns began to emerge from this systematic collection of accounts. The objects, whatever they were, appeared to favor certain types of locations and weather conditions. Clear skies and good visibility seemed to increase the likelihood of sightings, while reports were more common near military installations, particularly those involved in advanced aviation research. This correlation was troubling for several reasons, not least because it suggested the objects might be displaying some form of intelligence in their choice of observation points. More disturbing still were reports that described not just unusual objects, but unusual behavior. Witnesses described craft that appeared to respond to the presence of military aircraft, sometimes approaching them before accelerating away at impossible speeds. Radar operators reported contacts that defied conventional understanding of aerodynamics, making right-angle turns at velocities that should have destroyed any known material. Pilots, trained to observe and interpret aerial phenomena with professional precision, filed reports that their superiors found increasingly difficult to dismiss or explain. The quality of these witnesses presented Project SIGN with its most significant challenge. These were not hysterical civilians or attention-seeking fantasists, but military professionals whose credibility and judgment formed the foundation of national defense when experienced pilots reported objects that outperformed the most advanced aircraft in the American arsenal. The implications extended far beyond mere curiosity about unexplained phenomena. It was against this backdrop of mounting evidence and professional witness testimony that Project SIGN allegedly produced what would become known as the top-secret estimate of the situation. This document, if it ever existed, represented the first formal assessment by American intelligence of the possibility that the unidentified objects might represent technology of non-human origin. The estimate, according to later accounts by Captain Edward Ruppelt, concluded that the flying saucers were real, physical objects that demonstrated capabilities beyond current human technology and were most likely extraterrestrial in origin. The reaction to this conclusion, assuming it was ever formally presented, demonstrated the profound discomfort that such findings generated within the military establishment. The story, as later recounted, described the document being forwarded up the chain of command until it reached the desk of General Hoyt Vandenberg, the Air Force Chief of Staff. Vandenberg's office occupied one of the Pentagon's most prestigious locations, its windows offering a view across the Potomac River toward the monuments and government buildings of Washington, D.C. Vandenberg's reported rejection of the estimate was swift and decisive. The general, according to these accounts, found the extraterrestrial hypothesis unacceptable, not necessarily because the evidence was insufficient, but because the implications were too destabilizing to acknowledge officially. The document was allegedly ordered destroyed, its conclusions deemed too inflammatory for distribution even within the classified intelligence community. Whether this dramatic confrontation between evidence and institutional comfort actually occurred remains a matter of historical debate. The document itself, if it ever existed, has never been found in declassified archives, leading some researchers to conclude that the entire episode was either fabricated or greatly exaggerated. Others point to the consistency of accounts from multiple sources and the logical progression of events as evidence that something resembling this institutional crisis did indeed take place. What is certain is that by the end of 1948, Project SIGN was undergoing a fundamental transformation in both personnel and mission. The officers and scientists who had approached the investigation with genuine scientific curiosity found themselves replaced by individuals whose primary qualification seemed to be skepticism about the reality of the phenomena under study. The careful documentation and analysis that had characterized the project's early months gave way to a more dismissive approach that sought conventional explanations for even the most puzzling cases. This shift became formalized with the transition from Project SIGN to Project Grudge in February of 1949. The change was more than nominal. It represented a complete philosophical reorientation of the government's approach to unidentified aerial phenomena. Where SIGN had been established to investigate and understand, Grudge was designed to explain away and minimize. The new project's mission reflected this altered priority. Rather than seeking to determine what the objects were, Grudge was tasked with demonstrating what they were not. The emphasis shifted from collecting and analyzing evidence to providing reassuring explanations that would reduce public anxiety and military concern. The very name grudge seemed to acknowledge the Air Force's frustration with having to devote resources to phenomena that senior leadership preferred not to acknowledge. The personnel changes that accompanied this transition were equally significant. The scientists and engineers who had brought technical expertise to the investigation found their roles diminished or eliminated entirely. In their place came officers whose primary qualification was their ability to provide conventional explanations for unconventional reports. Regardless of how well those explanations fit the actual evidence, the methods employed by Project Grudge reflected this new philosophy rather than the careful case-by-case analysis that had characterized SIGEN. Grudge adopted a more systematic approach to debunking. Common explanations were developed for entire categories of sightings: bright stars or planets for nighttime observations, weather balloons for daylight encounters, psychological factors for cases involving multiple witnesses. These explanations were then applied broadly, often without the detailed investigation that might have revealed their inadequacy in specific instances. The public face of Project Grudge was one of reassuring competence and scientific rationality. Press releases emphasized the prosaic nature of most sightings, highlighting cases where conventional explanations could be definitively established, while downplaying those that remained genuinely puzzling. The message was clear and consistent. The flying saucer phenomenon was the result of misidentification, mass hysteria, and the tendency of poorly trained observers to misinterpret familiar objects under unusual conditions. This approach achieved its primary objective of reducing official concern about the phenomenon, but it came at the cost of scientific credibility and thoroughness. The careful documentation that had characterized Project SIGN gave way to superficial analysis designed to support predetermined conclusions. Cases that might have yielded valuable scientific data were dismissed without adequate investigation, their potential insights lost to the bureaucratic imperative to minimize the significance of the entire phenomenon. By December of 1949, the Air Force leadership felt confident enough in this approach to formally terminate Project Grudge. The final report concluded that UFO sightings were the result of conventional objects, mass hysteria, hoaxes, and reports by psychopathological persons. The language itself reflected the project's evolution from scientific inquiry to psychological dismissal. Witnesses who had been treated as credible observers under Project SIGN were now characterized as mentally unstable individuals whose accounts required no serious investigation. The termination of Project Grudge was presented as evidence that the flying saucer mystery had been solved through rational analysis and scientific method. The Air Force announced that no further investigation was necessary, as the phenomenon had been adequately explained and posed no threat to national security. The files were closed, the personnel reassigned, and the entire episode was treated as a temporary aberration that had been successfully contained through proper military procedure. But the silence that followed this official conclusion was not the silence of mystery resolved. It was the silence of questions that had been answered too quickly, of evidence that had been dismissed too easily, of witnesses whose credibility had been impugned rather than their accounts investigated. The flying objects themselves, whatever they might have been, had not disappeared simply because the Air Force had stopped looking for them. In the quiet offices where Project Grudge had conducted its abbreviated investigations, filing cabinets now sat locked and largely forgotten. The reports they contained, with their careful documentation of witness testimony and physical evidence, would gather dust for several years as the military pursued other priorities. But the phenomena they described continued to manifest, and the questions they raised continued to trouble those individuals within the government who remembered the more thorough investigations of Project SIGN's early months. The transition from SIGN to Grudge represented more than just a change in administrative designation. It marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between the American military and the unknown, from genuine inquiry toward institutional comfort, from scientific investigation toward public relations management. This transformation would prove to be temporary, as events in the early 1950s would demonstrate that some mysteries resist bureaucratic resolution, no matter how determined the effort to contain them. I remember the stillness that settled over Wright-Patterson Air Force Base during those early years of the 1950s, when the offices that had once buzzed with the urgent activity of Project Grudge sat largely empty, their windows gathering dust and their filing cabinets locked against secrets that no one seemed particularly interested in keeping anymore. The fluorescent lights that had illuminated late-night analysis sessions now flickered on only occasionally, when maintenance personnel made their rounds or when some administrative necessity required access to the abandoned files. The Korean War had begun in June of 1950, and America's military attention was focused on more immediate and tangible threats than mysterious objects in the sky. The halls of the Pentagon echoed with discussions of troop movements, supply lines, and tactical air support concrete problems that yielded to conventional military solutions. The abstract uncertainties of unidentified aerial phenomena seemed almost quaint, compared to the stark realities of combat operations and the daily casualty reports that arrived from the Pacific Theater. During this period, Project Grudge existed primarily as a filing system rather than an active investigation. The few personnel assigned to maintain the project treated it as a bureaucratic afterthought, processing incoming reports with the mechanical efficiency of clerks handling routine paperwork. New sightings were logged, briefly evaluated against standard explanations, and then filed away with minimal investigation or analysis. The careful scientific methodology that had characterized the early days of Project SIGN was now just a memory preserved in dusty folders. The reports themselves continued to arrive with surprising persistence, despite the official conclusion that the phenomenon had been adequately explained. Airmail envelopes bearing the return addresses of military bases, police departments, and civilian observers found their way to Wright-Patterson at a steady pace, their contents describing encounters that seemed to defy the categories that Project Grudge had established for conventional explanation. These accounts were processed with the same detached professionalism that characterized all military correspondence, but they were no longer subjected to the kind of detailed analysis that might have revealed patterns or generated new insights. I can imagine those reports stacking up in metal trays, awaiting the attention of overworked clerks, who had neither the time nor the inclination to look beyond the surface details. A sighting of multiple objects over a military installation would be attributed to weather balloons or aircraft running exercises. Radar contacts that appeared to demonstrate impossible acceleration would be dismissed as equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. Witness testimony from experienced pilots would be explained away as misidentification of stars, planets, or conventional aircraft seen under unusual conditions. This systematic dismissal was not necessarily the result of deliberate deception or conspiracy, but rather the natural tendency of any bureaucratic system to process information according to established patterns. The personnel handling these reports had been trained to find conventional explanations, and they dutifully applied this training without necessarily considering whether their explanations adequately addressed the specific details of each case. The institutional momentum of Project Grudge continued to operate even in the absence of active leadership or scientific oversight. The physical environment of these quasi-dormant offices reflected their reduced status within the Air Force hierarchy. Desks that had once been cleared each evening by security personnel now accumulated the detritus of routine administrative work, coffee-stained reports, outdated meteorological charts, and correspondence that had been read once and then set aside for eventual filing. The maps on the walls, which had once been updated regularly with pins marking the locations of new sightings, now showed patterns that were months or even years out of date. Yet beneath this surface calm, the phenomena that had originally sparked military concern continued to manifest with troubling consistency. Pilots flying training missions over the American Southwest reported objects that paced their aircraft before accelerating away at impossible speeds. Radar operators at military installations noted contacts that appeared and disappeared in ways that defied conventional understanding of atmospheric propagation. Ground personnel at air bases from California to Maine continued to observe lights and objects that bore no resemblance to any known aircraft or natural phenomena. These ongoing reports created a peculiar form of cognitive dissonance within the military establishment. Officially, the mystery had been solved and the investigation concluded. The flying saucer phenomenon had been explained as a combination of misidentification, mass hysteria, and psychological disorders among witnesses. Yet, the reports themselves continued to arrive, often from the same types of highly trained military personnel whose expertise and credibility formed the foundation of America's defense capabilities. This contradiction was particularly apparent at installations involved in advanced aviation research and development. Edwards Air Force Base in California, where experimental aircraft routinely pushed the boundaries of flight technology, reported sightings of objects that seemed to exceed even the most classified American capabilities. Test pilots who were accustomed to flying aircraft that represented the cutting edge of human engineering filed accounts of encounters with craft that demonstrated performance characteristics decades ahead of anything in the American arsenal. The pattern was repeated at other facilities involved in sensitive military research. Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico, White Sands Proving Ground, and other installations where rockets and guided missiles were being developed and tested became regular sources of reports describing objects that appeared to observe these activities with what seemed like deliberate intelligence. The correlation between advanced military technology and UFO sightings was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, even for those committed to conventional explanations. Among the personnel who had been involved in the earlier, more thorough investigations, a sense of professional frustration began to develop. engineers and intelligence officers who had witnessed the systematic analysis of Project SIGN's early period found themselves troubled by the cursory treatment that interesting cases now received. They had seen evidence that deserved careful scientific study being dismissed with explanations that barely addressed the fundamental questions raised by witness testimony and physical data. This frustration was particularly acute among individuals who had direct experience with the most puzzling cases from the SIGN era. They had interviewed credible witnesses, examined physical evidence, and conducted detailed analyses that revealed the inadequacy of simple explanations. The transition to Project Grudge's dismissive approach had not erased their memories of cases that genuinely challenged conventional understanding, but it had eliminated their ability to pursue these mysteries through official channels. Major General Charles P. Cabell, who served as the Air Force's Director of Intelligence, found himself in the uncomfortable position of reconciling official policy with continuing reports from his own personnel. Cabell's office in the Pentagon received regular intelligence briefings that included summaries of UFO sightings from military installations around the world. While these reports were processed according to Project Grudge's established procedures, they continued to describe phenomena that seemed to resist conventional explanation. The general's predicament was compounded by the international dimension of the mystery. Allied military forces were reporting similar sightings, and intelligence services from friendly nations were sharing accounts that paralleled American experiences. The British Royal Air Force had established its own investigation, initially known as the Flying Saucer Working Party, which was conducting analysis that in some ways exceeded the thoroughness of America's current approach. Canadian and Australian military forces were also documenting encounters that suggested the phenomenon was global in scope rather than limited to American airspace. These international reports created diplomatic complexities that extended beyond the purely military aspects of the mystery. Allied intelligence services expected information sharing on matters that might affect mutual security interests. But American policy had essentially classified the entire UFO phenomenon as solved and unworthy of continued investigation. This created the awkward situation where allies were pursuing active research into phenomena that the United States had officially dismissed as non-existent or explained. The scientific community outside of military circles was also beginning to take notice of the accumulated evidence. Astronomers, physicists, and engineers who had initially dismissed the flying saucer reports as popular delusion were encountering accounts from colleagues within the military-industrial complex that suggested something genuinely anomalous was occurring. The informal networks that connected researchers across institutional boundaries carried stories of encounters that seemed to exceed the explanatory power of conventional science. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who had served as a scientific consultant to both Project Sign and Project Grudge, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position during this period. His role had been to provide astronomical explanations for sightings that might involve misidentification of celestial objects, and he had initially approached this task with the confident skepticism that characterized academic science of the era. However, his continued exposure to the most credible cases had begun to erode his certainty that all UFO reports could be adequately explained through conventional means. Hynek's position at Northwestern University provided him with both the academic freedom and the scientific credibility to question official conclusions. But his ongoing relationship with the Air Force created professional constraints on how publicly he could express his doubts. The astronomer found himself walking a careful line between his growing scientific curiosity about genuinely puzzling cases and his obligation to support the military's public position that the phenomenon had been adequately explained. The media landscape during this period reflected the broader cultural shift away from intense interest in flying saucers toward other concerns. The Korean War dominated headlines, while domestic issues like the Communist Party, investigations, and the beginning of the McCarthy era provided more immediate sources of public anxiety. Flying saucers, which had captured the national imagination just a few years earlier, were increasingly relegated to the realm of science fiction and popular entertainment rather than serious news coverage. This reduction in media attention served the Air Force's interests by removing much of the public pressure for continued investigation. But it also created conditions where unusual incidents could occur without generating the widespread scrutiny that had characterized the late 1940s. Military personnel who encountered unexplained phenomena were less likely to report their experiences to journalists, and civilian witnesses found fewer outlets willing to treat their accounts as legitimate news rather than human interest stories. The technological context of this period also provided new possibilities for both conventional explanations and genuine mysteries. The rapid development of jet aircraft, guided missiles, and experimental flight technologies created a constant stream of test flights and military exercises that could account for at least some unusual sightings. However, these same technological advances also made it easier to distinguish between known military capabilities and reported phenomena that exceeded them. By late 1951, the accumulated weight of continuing reports, international pressure for cooperation, and internal dissatisfaction with the superficial analysis of Project Grudge began to generate pressure for a more serious approach to the investigation. The quiet years were coming to an end, and the stage was being set for a renewed commitment to understanding phenomena that had proven remarkably resistant to bureaucratic dismissal. The filing cabinets at Wright-Patterson held more than just the accumulated reports of 2 years of minimal investigation. They contained the documented experiences of military personnel whose professional competence was essential to national defense, physical evidence that had never been adequately analyzed, and patterns of sightings that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random misidentification. This archive of the unexplained would soon become the foundation for a new and more ambitious attempt to solve the mystery of unidentified flying objects. In those quiet offices where dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through unwashed windows, the mystery waited with the patience that characterizes all genuine puzzles. The questions that had sparked the creation of Project Sign had not been answered by the cursory analysis of Project Grudge, and they would not remain dormant forever. The institutional needs of the Air Force were about to collide once again with phenomena that refused to conform to bureaucratic categories, setting the stage for the most extensive and controversial UFO investigation in American history. I remember the morning when Captain Edward Ruppelt first walked into the offices that would house the newly christened Project Bluebook, carrying with him the kind of methodical determination that transforms bureaucratic routine into genuine investigation. The Ohio winter was giving way to an early spring in 1952, and the windows of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base caught the pale sunlight that filtered through clouds heavy with the promise of change. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, as if the institutional lethargy of the past 2 years was finally beginning to lift. Ruppelt was not the kind of officer one might have expected to inherit such an unusual assignment. He possessed an aeronautical engineering degree from Iowa State University and had served as a bombardier during World War II, flying missions over the Pacific that had given him an intimate understanding of both aircraft capabilities and the challenges of aerial observation. His approach to problems was systematic and thorough, characterized by the kind of patient attention to detail that distinguished competent engineers from merely adequate ones. The office space that had been allocated to the revived UFO investigation reflected the Air Force's renewed commitment to taking the phenomenon seriously. Gone were the dusty, neglected rooms that had housed the final days of Project Grudge. In their place were clean, well-lit offices equipped with modern filing systems, updated communications equipment, and the kind of organizational infrastructure that suggested this would be a genuine research effort rather than a bureaucratic afterthought. The first task that Ruppelt set for himself was a comprehensive review of the accumulated files from both Project SIGN and Project Grudge. These documents, some of which had not been examined thoroughly in years, contained the raw material from which patterns might emerge and genuine insights might be developed. Ruppelt approached this archive with the same systematic attention he had once applied to bombing targets and aircraft specifications, creating detailed indices and cross-references that would allow for meaningful statistical analysis. The filing cabinets themselves became instruments of scientific method in Ruppelt's hands. Each case was assigned a standardized number, and the files were reorganized according to geographical location, date, type of witness, and reported characteristics of the observed objects. This reorganization revealed correlations that had been obscured by the haphazard filing systems of previous investigations, including the troubling concentration of sightings around military installations involved in classified research. One of Ruppelt's most significant innovations was his decision to replace the sensationalistic terminology that had characterized previous investigations. The phrase flying saucer carried connotations of science fiction and popular entertainment that made serious scientific discussion difficult. In its place, Ruppelt introduced the term unidentified flying object, or UFO, which provided a neutral descriptor that focused attention on the fundamental question of identification rather than assumptions about origin or nature. This linguistic precision extended to all aspects of the investigation under Ruppelt's direction. Witness interviews were conducted using standardized questionnaires that gathered specific technical data rather than impressionistic accounts. Weather conditions, astronomical events, and military or civilian air traffic were systematically checked for each reported sighting. The casual acceptance of conventional explanations that had characterized Project Grudge was replaced by detailed analysis that either definitively established conventional causes or acknowledged the inadequacy of such explanations. The transformation was immediately apparent in the quality of the investigation reports that began to emerge from Project Bluebook, rather than the brief, dismissive summaries that had been the hallmark of Project Grudge. These new reports provided comprehensive analysis that acknowledged both the strengths and limitations of available evidence. Cases that could be definitively explained were closed with detailed documentation of the conventional cause, while genuinely puzzling incidents were honestly categorized as unexplained rather than forced into inadequate explanatory categories. Ruppelt's commitment to scientific objectivity was perhaps most clearly demonstrated by his personnel decisions. Early in his tenure, he dismissed 3 staff members whose approach to the investigation he found unsatisfactory. One, because he was too quick to accept extraterrestrial explanations. Another, because he was too eager to dismiss all reports as conventional phenomena. And a third, because he seemed more interested in generating publicity than in conducting thorough analysis. This willingness to prioritize scientific rigor over institutional comfort set the tone for the entire project. The captain's approach to dealing with the media and the public also reflected his commitment to transparency and factual accuracy, rather than the defensive secrecy that had characterized previous investigations. Project Bluebook, under Ruppelt's direction, issued regular press releases that provided honest assessments of the investigation's progress. These statements acknowledged both the cases that had been successfully explained and those that remained genuinely mysterious, treating the public as capable of understanding nuanced information rather than requiring oversimplified reassurance. The physical environment of the Project Bluebook offices began to reflect this more serious approach to the investigation. The walls were covered with detailed maps showing the locations and dates of reported sightings, creating visual patterns that might reveal geographical or temporal correlations. Meteorological charts and astronomical data were regularly updated to facilitate the analysis of potential conventional explanations. The desks were equipped with the latest scientific calculators and measurement devices, tools that enabled precise analysis of witness testimony and physical evidence. Perhaps most importantly, Ruppelt established formal consultation relationships with leading scientists and technical experts from both military and civilian institutions. The project's scientific advisory panel included astronomers, physicists, meteorologists, and engineers whose expertise could be brought to bear on specific aspects of particularly puzzling cases. This represented a fundamental departure from the isolation that had characterized previous investigations, opening the project to outside scrutiny and expert analysis. The Battelle Memorial Institute, a respected research organization with extensive experience in statistical analysis and technical investigation, was commissioned to conduct a comprehensive study of all Air Force UFO cases from 1947 through 1952. This study, which would eventually be published as Project Bluebook Special Report No. 14, represented the most thorough statistical analysis of UFO data that had ever been attempted. The Institute's researchers applied rigorous scientific methodology to the accumulated case files, looking for patterns and correlations that might provide insights into the nature of the phenomenon. The transformation that Ruppelt brought to the UFO investigation was evident not only in the improved quality of individual case analysis, but also in the overall approach to the mystery. Rather than beginning with predetermined conclusions about what the objects could or could not be, the investigation now started with the fundamental question of what had actually been observed. This seemingly simple shift in perspective had profound implications for the quality of the analysis and the credibility of the conclusions. Under Ruppelt's direction, Project Bluebook developed a classification system that reflected the complexity of the phenomenon, rather than forcing all reports into oversimplified categories. Sightings were classified as identified when conventional explanations could be definitively established. Insufficient information when the available data was inadequate for meaningful analysis, and unidentified when thorough investigation failed to produce a satisfactory conventional explanation. This honest acknowledgement of the limits of current knowledge represented a significant departure from the forced explanations that had characterized previous investigations. The captain's background in aeronautical engineering proved particularly valuable in analyzing reports that described unusual flight characteristics. His understanding of aircraft performance limitations allowed him to distinguish between sightings that might involve misidentified conventional aircraft and those that described capabilities that exceeded known technology. This technical expertise was essential in evaluating the most credible reports from military pilots and other trained observers. The office routine that developed under Ruppelt's leadership reflected the methodical approach that characterized all aspects of the investigation. Each morning began with a review of new reports that had arrived overnight, followed by detailed planning of investigation activities for cases that required fieldwork. Afternoons were typically devoted to analysis and report writing, while evenings often found staff members working late to complete the thorough documentation that had become the hallmark of the revived project. The filing systems that Ruppelt established were designed not merely to store information, but to facilitate analysis and pattern recognition, cross-indexed by date, location, witness type, object characteristics, and weather conditions. The files became a research tool that could generate insights unavailable to previous investigations. The captain himself spent hours reviewing these organized records, looking for correlations that might provide clues to the nature and origin of the reported phenomena. The quality of witness interviews improved dramatically under Ruppelt's systematic approach, rather than the casual conversations that had characterized previous investigations. Interviews now followed standardized protocols, designed to gather specific technical information while avoiding leading questions that might bias witness testimony. These interviews were conducted by trained personnel who understood both the importance of accurate data collection and the psychological factors that might influence witness accounts. The attention to scientific methodology extended to the analysis of photographic evidence, which had often been dismissed or inadequately examined by previous investigations. Project Bluebook, under Ruppelt's direction, established relationships with photographic experts who could analyze images for evidence of hoaxing, misidentification, or genuine anomalous phenomena. This technical analysis was conducted according to accepted scientific standards, with conclusions based on measurable evidence rather than subjective impressions. The transformation that Ruppelt brought to the UFO investigation created an atmosphere of professional competence and scientific integrity that had been largely absent from previous efforts. The staff members who worked under his direction understood that they were engaged in genuine scientific research rather than public relations management, and their work reflected this elevated sense of purpose and responsibility. As the spring of 1952 progressed into summer, Project Bluebook under Captain Ruppelt's leadership had established itself as a credible scientific investigation that approached the UFO phenomenon with the same systematic methodology that characterized other areas of military research and development. The foundation had been laid for what would prove to be the most comprehensive and professionally conducted investigation of unidentified flying objects in American history. The morning sun that had welcomed Ruppelt to his new assignment continued to illuminate offices where genuine scientific inquiry was replacing bureaucratic dismissal, where careful analysis was supplanting hasty explanation, and where the mystery of unidentified flying objects was finally receiving the serious attention that its complexity demanded. The stage was set for revelations that would test both the palyndology that Ruppelt had established and the institutional courage of the Air Force that had commissioned him to seek the truth. I remember the oppressive heat that settled over Washington, D.C. during the summer of 1952, when the air conditioning units in government buildings hummed constantly but never quite managed to dispel the humid weight that seemed to press down on the Capitol like a physical presence. The asphalt runways at National Airport shimmered with heat mirages during the day, creating the kind of atmospheric disturbance that radar operators had learned to recognize and compensate for. But on the night of July 19th, the green screens in the airport's control tower began displaying returns that defied all conventional explanations. The control room at Washington National Airport was a cramped space filled with the steady electronic hum of radar equipment and radio communications. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and the metallic temps of vacuum tubes operating at high temperatures. Harry Barnes, the chief air traffic controller, had been working these night shifts for years, guiding commercial and military aircraft through some of the most controlled airspace in the world. The routine was familiar and comforting: the regular sweep of the radar beam, the predictable patterns of scheduled flights, the constant chatter of pilots checking in and requesting clearance. But sometime after 11 o'clock that evening, Barnes noticed returns on his scope that didn't correspond to any known traffic. The objects appeared as solid contacts, moving at speeds that alternated between impossibly slow and impossibly fast. They would hover motionless for minutes at a time, then accelerate to velocities that his calculations suggested exceeded 1,000 miles per hour. The contacts were not behaving like aircraft, whether phenomena or equipment malfunctions. They seemed to be under intelligent control. Barnes called over his colleagues to verify what he was seeing. One by one, the other controllers gathered around the primary radar scope, watching the mysterious returns move in patterns that violated everything they understood about aerodynamics and flight characteristics. The objects appeared to be operating in restricted airspace over the White House and the Capitol building, areas where unauthorized aircraft would normally trigger immediate military response. Yet, these contacts seemed to move through the restricted zones with complete impunity. The secondary radar at nearby Andrews Air Force Base was also tracking the objects, confirming that this was not a malfunction of the national airport equipment. The returns appeared on multiple independent systems, creating a chain of evidence that would be difficult to dismiss as technical error or operator inexperience. The controllers began logging the positions and movements of the contacts, creating a documentary record of an event that was rapidly escalating beyond routine anomaly into genuine crisis. At approximately 1:15 in the morning, Barnes made the decision to contact Andrews Air Force Base directly. The conversation that followed would be preserved in official records and would later become a crucial element in the most significant UFO incident in American history. The Air Force personnel at Andrews confirmed that they were also tracking unknown objects in the same general area, and that their radar operators were observing flight characteristics that exceeded the performance of any known aircraft. The situation took on a new dimension when airline pilots began reporting visual contact with the objects that were appearing on radar screens. Captain S.C. Pierman, flying a Capital Airlines flight into Washington, reported seeing 6 bright lights moving in formation near his aircraft. The objects, he noted, were clearly visible against the night sky and appeared to be keeping pace with his airliner, before suddenly accelerating away at tremendous speed. The correlation between radar contacts and visual sightings eliminated the possibility that the entire incident was the result of equipment malfunction. The control tower at National Airport became the epicenter of an unfolding drama that would capture national attention and force a fundamental reconsideration of official policy. Toward unidentified flying objects, the radio traffic between controllers, pilots, and military personnel created a real-time documentary of events that seemed to challenge the most basic assumptions about American airspace security. The conversations, preserved on magnetic tape, would later provide researchers with unprecedented insight into how trained professionals responded to encounters with genuinely inexplicable phenomena. As the night progressed, reports continued to arrive from multiple sources. Radar operators at different locations were tracking objects that appeared and disappeared without warning, performed maneuvers that should have destroyed any known aircraft, and seemed to demonstrate awareness of military attempts to intercept them. The contacts were not random or chaotic. They displayed patterns of behavior that suggested intelligence and purpose, rather than natural phenomena or equipment error. The military response was swift but ultimately ineffective. Fighter jets were scrambled from Newcastle Air Force Base, but the pilots reported that the objects they were attempting to intercept consistently outmaneuvered them. Lieutenant William Patterson, flying an F-9 Foster, described being surrounded by multiple objects that appeared as bright white lights. When he attempted to close on one of the contacts, it accelerated away at a speed that made pursuit impossible. The objects seemed to be toying with the interceptor aircraft, allowing them to approach within a certain distance before demonstrating capabilities that rendered military pursuit futile. The incident at Andrews Air Force Base provided additional confirmation of the reality of the phenomenon. Airman First Class William Brady, working as a control tower operator at the base, observed a large orange sphere hovering near the flight line. The object remained stationary for several minutes before suddenly accelerating and disappearing into the night sky. This visual sighting from military personnel at a secure installation eliminated any possibility that the radar contacts were the result of civilian misidentification or hoaxing. The events of July 19th were repeated exactly 1 week later, on July 26th, creating what would become known as the Washington National Airport UFO incident, or simply the Washington Flap. The second occurrence followed almost exactly the same pattern as the first multiple radar contacts at both National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base. Visual confirmations from airline pilots and military personnel, and the complete inability of interceptor aircraft to successfully engage the objects. The repetition of the incident eliminated the possibility that the first occurrence had been an isolated equipment failure or atmospheric anomaly. The objects returned to the same general area, displayed the same flight characteristics, and generated the same types of responses from radar systems and human observers. The pattern suggested that whatever was responsible for the sightings was operating according to some form of intelligence or purpose, rather than representing random phenomena. The media response to the Washington incidents was immediate and intense. Newspaper headlines across the country reported that unidentified flying objects had been detected over the nation's capital, and that military fighters had been unable to intercept them. The story captured public attention in a way that no UFO incident had since the original flying saucer wave of 1947, but with the crucial difference that this event had been documented by multiple radar systems and witnessed by trained military and civilian personnel. The pressure for an official explanation mounted rapidly as news of the incidents spread. President Harry Truman himself called for answers, reportedly contacting the Air Force directly to demand a briefing on what had occurred over Washington. The president's involvement elevated the incident from a military curiosity to a matter of national security, requiring immediate attention from the highest levels of government and military command. Major General John Samford, the Air Force Director of Intelligence, found himself in the unprecedented position of having to explain to the press and the public how unidentified objects had operated with apparent impunity in the most restricted airspace in the United States. The press conference that he convened on July 29, 1952, was the largest UFO-related media briefing in Air Force history, with reporters from major newspapers, magazines, and radio networks in attendance. Samford's explanation relied heavily on meteorological phenomena, particularly temperature inversions that could create false returns on radar screens. He suggested that the radar contacts were the result of atmospheric conditions that bent radar beams in unusual ways, creating the illusion of solid objects where none actually existed. The visual sightings, he argued, were likely misidentifications of stars, planets, or conventional aircraft seen under unusual atmospheric conditions. This explanation was immediately controversial, not least because it failed to account for several crucial aspects of the incidents. The correlation between radar contacts and simultaneous visual sightings suggested that the phenomenon involved more than just equipment malfunctions. The behavior of the contacts, their ability to accelerate, change direction, and apparently respond to the presence of interceptor aircraft indicated characteristics that were difficult to reconcile with atmospheric disturbances or false radar returns. The technical inadequacy of the official explanation became apparent to radar operators and pilots who had directly experienced the incidents. Harry Barnes, the chief controller at National Airport, publicly disputed the temperature inversion theory, noting that he and his colleagues were trained to recognize and compensate for such atmospheric effects. The radar contacts, he insisted, displayed characteristics that were distinctly different from the returns typically generated by temperature inversions or other meteorological phenomena. The Washington incidents marked a crucial turning point in the government's approach to unidentified flying objects. For the first time since the creation of Project Bluebook, the phenomenon had generated a level of public attention and official concern that could not be managed. Through routine administrative procedures, the events over the nation's capital had demonstrated that UFOs, whatever their nature or origin, possessed the capacity to create genuine crises of public confidence and national security. The radar tapes from both National Airport and Andrews Air Force Base were preserved, providing a permanent record of the technical data that documented the incidents. These recordings would later be analyzed by multiple independent experts, some of whom concluded that the contacts displayed characteristics consistent with solid, maneuvering objects rather than atmospheric anomalies or equipment malfunctions. The existence of this technical documentation made it impossible to dismiss the Washington incidents as purely subjective experiences or unreliable witness testimony. Within the halls of the Pentagon and the offices of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Washington flap triggered discussions that went far beyond the narrow question of what the objects might have been. Intelligence officials began to consider the possibility that the UFO phenomenon, regardless of its ultimate nature, could be exploited by foreign adversaries to create panic, overload air defense systems, or mask genuine attacks. The objects themselves might be benign or non-existent, but their capacity to generate public hysteria and institutional confusion represented a potential vulnerability that demanded serious attention. The summer heat that had oppressed Washington during those crucial weeks in July began to give way to the cooler temperatures of early autumn. But the questions raised by the radar contacts and visual sightings lingered like humidity that refuses to dissipate. The Washington incidents had shattered the comfortable assumption that UFO reports could be safely ignored or icily explained away. Whatever had appeared on those radar screens and in the skies over the Capitol had demonstrated the power to challenge institutional authority and demand answers that the government was not prepared to provide. In the climate-controlled offices, where intelligence officials were already beginning to plan their response to the Washington crisis, the recognition was dawning that Project Bluebook's scientific approach might not be sufficient to manage the broader implications of the UFO phenomenon. The methodical investigation that Captain Ruppelt had established was producing credible evidence and honest analysis, but it was also generating questions that were becoming increasingly difficult to contain within the boundaries of military secrecy and public reassurance. I remember the austere conference rooms of the Central Intelligence Agency during those cold January days of 1953, when the morning frost on the windows seemed to reflect the institutional chill that had settled over official discussions of unidentified flying objects. The building itself was still relatively new, its corridors echoing with the purposeful footsteps of intelligence professionals who dealt daily with threats both visible and hidden. But the threat they were gathering to discuss that winter was unlike any they had previously confronted, not a foreign military capability or espionage operation, but the American public's own fascination with mysteries in the sky. The conference room where the Robertson panel convened was furnished with the kind of utilitarian efficiency that characterized government facilities of the era. Metal folding chairs surrounded a long wooden table, and the walls were bare except for security notices and the standard government tissue clock that marked time with mechanical precision. The air carried the scent of fresh coffee and the lingering traces of cigarette smoke from previous meetings, creating an atmosphere that was both mundane and charged with significance. Dr. H.P. Robertson, the theoretical physicist from the California Institute of Technology, who would chair the panel, brought to the assignment a reputation for analytical rigor that had been honed through years of work on classified defense projects. His colleagues on the panel represented some of the most respected scientific minds in America, men whose expertise in astronomy, physics, and atmospheric science gave them the credentials necessary to evaluate claims that seemed to challenge conventional understanding of natural phenomena. The documents that awaited the panel's review filled several filing cabinets, representing 5 years of accumulated reports, photographs, and analysis from projects Sign, Grudge, and Bluebook. Captain Ruppelt had prepared detailed summaries of the most significant cases, including the Washington incidents that had triggered this emergency review. The material was organized with the same systematic attention to detail that had characterized his transformation of Project Bluebook, but now it was being presented to scientists whose primary obligation was not to the Air Force, but to the broader interests of national security. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the astronomer who had served as scientific consultant to all 3 Air Force UFO projects, found himself in the unique position of bridging the military investigation and the civilian scientific review. His years of exposure to the most credible UFO reports had gradually eroded his initial skepticism, leaving him with the uncomfortable recognition that some cases genuinely resisted conventional explanation. Yet his role on the Robertson panel required him to maintain the objective stance of academic science, evaluating evidence without regard for its potential implications for his own evolving views. The panel's methodology reflected the scientific training of its members. Rather than conducting original investigations or examining evidence in the field, they focused on the documentary record that had been accumulated by the Air Force projects. This approach had both strengths and limitations. While it allowed for systematic analysis of patterns across large numbers of cases, it also created distance between the scientists and the primary evidence that might have influenced their conclusions. The classified films that the panel reviewed included some of the most compelling visual documentation of the UFO phenomenon. The Great Falls, Montana footage showed objects that appeared to move with the controlled flight characteristics of aircraft, but at speeds and in formations that seemed inconsistent with known military or civilian aviation. The Tremonton, Utah film captured multiple objects maneuvering in ways that suggested intelligence and coordination rather than random atmospheric phenomena. These films represented the kind of physical evidence that scientists preferred to analyze, yet their interpretation remained frustratingly ambiguous. The panel's daily sessions followed a routine that reflected both the urgency of their mission and the constraints of their schedule. Each morning began with coffee and the ritual examination of classified documents, followed by methodical review of case files and technical analysis of photographic and radar evidence. The afternoons were devoted to discussion and debate as the scientists attempted to reconcile the evidence with their understanding of natural phenomena and technological possibilities. Luis Alvarez, the Nobel laureate physicist who brought perhaps the greatest scientific prestige to the panel, approached the UFO evidence with the same analytical rigor he had applied to nuclear physics and cosmic ray research. His expertise in radiation detection and particle physics provided insights into the technical aspects of radar, returns and photographic evidence that might escape observers with different scientific backgrounds. Yet even Alvarez's formidable analytical capabilities encountered limits when confronted with evidence that seemed to transcend conventional explanatory categories. The panel's evaluation of witness testimony revealed the fundamental challenge that had plagued UFO investigations since their inception. The most credible reports often came from military pilots, radar operators, and other trained observers whose professional competence was essential to national defense. Dismissing their accounts as misidentification or delusion carried implications that extended far beyond the UFO phenomenon itself, raised questions about the reliability of the very personnel on whom military security depended. Lloyd Berkner, the geophysicist whose expertise in atmospheric science was crucial to evaluating meteorological explanations for UFO sightings, found himself confronting cases that seemed to resist conventional atmospheric interpretation. The Washington incidents, with their combination of radar returns and visual confirmations, presented particular challenges for explanations based on temperature inversions or other meteorological phenomena. The behavior of the radar contacts, their apparent responses to the presence of interceptor aircrafts, suggested characteristics that were difficult to reconcile with passive atmospheric disturbances. The discussions that took place in that sterile conference room during those January days revealed the tension between scientific objectivity and institutional necessity. The scientists were tasked with evaluating evidence according to rigorous analytical standards, but they were also expected to provide conclusions that would serve the broader purposes of national security policy. This dual obligation created pressures that pure scientific research rarely encounters, forcing the panel to consider not only what the evidence suggested, but also what recommendations would best serve the interests of American defense. The Central Intelligence Agency's concerns extended beyond the immediate question of what UFOs might represent. Intelligence officials were increasingly worried about the phenomenon's potential for exploitation by foreign adversaries. The Washington incidents had demonstrated the capacity of UFO reports to generate mass media attention and public anxiety. In the context of the Cold War, this represented a vulnerability that could potentially be manipulated by Soviet psychological warfare operations. The strategic implications of UFO hysteria became a central focus of the panel's deliberations. Even if the objects themselves were entirely explainable or non-existent, their power to capture public attention and generate institutional confusion represented a legitimate security concern. A coordinated campaign of false UFO reports could potentially overwhelm air defense systems, create panic that would disrupt civilian and military operations, and undermine confidence in government institutions. The panel's consideration of Project Bluebook itself revealed fundamental tensions in the Air Force's approach to UFO investigation. Ruppelt's commitment to scientific methodology was producing increasingly credible evidence for genuinely anomalous phenomena. But this evidence was also contributing to the public fascination that intelligence officials viewed as a security risk. The more thoroughly Project Bluebook investigated UFO reports, the more difficult it became to dismiss them as simple misidentifications or hoaxes. The classified nature of the panel's proceedings meant that their discussions took place without the public scrutiny that might have influenced their conclusions. The scientists could speak candidly about evidence and possibilities that would have been politically sensitive if discussed in open forums. This freedom from public accountability allowed for more honest evaluation of the evidence, but it also meant that their conclusions would be implemented without public debate or scientific peer review. The panel's access to classified military information provided context for UFO sightings that was unavailable to civilian researchers. Knowledge of secret military aircraft tests, experimental radar systems, and classified flight operations allowed the scientists to evaluate some reports in light of information that could not be publicly disclosed. This classified context helped explain some UFO sightings, but it also revealed the complexity of distinguishing between genuine anomalies and misidentification of legitimate military activities. As the panel's brief but intensive review period drew to a close, the scientists found themselves confronting a phenomenon that resisted easy categorization. The evidence for genuinely anomalous aerial phenomena was stronger than many had expected, but the national security implications of acknowledging this evidence were more complex than simple scientific analysis could address. The UFO mystery was revealing itself to be not just a scientific puzzle, but a challenge to the relationship between evidence, policy, and public confidence in government institutions. The recommendations that emerged from the Robertson panel would fundamentally alter the trajectory of American UFO investigation, transforming it from scientific inquiry into strategic public relations. But those recommendations were born from the recognition that some mysteries carry implications that extend far beyond their immediate scientific interest, challenging institutions to balance the pursuit of truth with the requirements of social stability and national security. The winter cold that had pressed against the windows of that CIA conference room seemed to penetrate the discussions themselves, bringing a chill of institutional calculation to questions that had once been pursued with the warmth of scientific curiosity. The scientists had convened to evaluate evidence, but they would leave having confronted the limits of what democratic societies are prepared to acknowledge when evidence challenges the comfortable assumptions on which social order depends. I remember the subtle changes that began to creep through the offices of Project Bluebook during the spring of 1953, like the gradual shift in light that comes when clouds move across the sun without anyone quite noticing the moment when brightness becomes shadow. The same desks remained, the same filing cabinets lined the walls, and the same maps covered the bulletin boards. But something fundamental in the atmosphere had altered. The eager pursuit of understanding that had characterized Captain Ruppelt's scientific approach was slowly giving way to something more mechanical, more predictable, more concerned with reaching predetermined conclusions than with following evidence wherever it might lead. The Robertson panel's recommendations had been classified, distributed only to those officials with the appropriate clearances and the need to know, but their effects rippled through the investigation like waves from a stone dropped into still water, creating changes that were felt long before their source was understood. The panel had concluded that UFOs posed no direct threat to national security, but they had identified a more subtle and potentially more dangerous indirect threat: the American public's fascination with the phenomenon itself. The scientists had recommended a systematic program of public education designed to reduce interest in UFO reports and strip them of their power to generate mass excitement. This educational campaign was to be conducted through multiple channels, from authoritative scientific articles in respected publications to television programs that would present UFO sightings in a more mundane light. The goal was not necessarily to convince the public that UFOs were impossible, but rather to make them seem uninteresting, routine, and unworthy of the kind of passionate attention that had followed the Washington incidents. Within Project Bluebook itself, these recommendations translated into a fundamental shift in operational priorities. The careful case-by-case analysis that had been Ruppelt's hallmark began to give way to more standardized approaches that emphasized rapid closure rather than thorough investigation. New personnel were assigned to the project, many of whom seemed less interested in understanding anomalous phenomena than in explaining them away through conventional means. The filing systems that had once been tools of scientific inquiry gradually transformed into instruments of bureaucratic processing. Cases were still numbered and catalogued with the same apparent precision, but the investigations themselves became increasingly perfunctory. Standard explanations were developed for common categories of sightings aircraft, navigation lights for nocturnal observations, weather balloons for daylight encounters, astronomical objects for reports that occurred during dawn or dusk hours. These explanations were then applied broadly, often without the detailed analysis that might have revealed their inadequacy in specific instances. The change was perhaps most evident in the treatment of witness testimony. Under Ruppelt's direction, credible witnesses, particularly military personnel with technical training, had been interviewed thoroughly and their accounts carefully documented. The assumption had been that trained observers were likely to provide accurate descriptions of what they had seen, even if the objects themselves remained unexplained. Now, however, witness credibility became secondary to the need to find conventional explanations for their reports. The physical environment of the Project Bluebook offices began to reflect this altered mission. The detailed maps that had tracked sighting patterns were updated less frequently, as geographic and temporal correlations were no longer considered relevant to investigations focused primarily on debunking the scientific instruments that had been used to analyze photographic and physical evidence were used more sparingly, since detailed technical analysis might complicate efforts to provide simple explanations for complex phenomena. The relationship between Project Bluebook and the media underwent a corresponding transformation. The regular press releases that Ruppelt had issued, with their honest acknowledgments of both explained and unexplained cases, were replaced by more carefully managed communications that emphasized the project's success in providing conventional explanations for reported sightings. Journalists were given access to cases that had been definitively identified as conventional phenomena, while the more puzzling incidents were either classified or subjected to explanations that might not survive rigorous scrutiny but served the purpose of bureaucratic closure. This shift in approach was particularly evident in the handling of photographic evidence. During the Ruppelt era, photographs and films had been subjected to detailed technical analysis by experts who could identify evidence of hoaxing, determine the characteristics of photographed objects, and evaluate the credibility of the evidence. Now, photographic analysis became more cursory, with explanations often based on preliminary examination rather than comprehensive study. If a conventional explanation could be proposed, no matter how speculative, was often accepted as adequate closure for the case. The personnel changes that accompanied this transformation reflected the project's altered priorities. Scientists and engineers who had brought technical expertise to the investigation found their roles diminished or eliminated entirely. In their place came individuals whose primary qualification was their ability to provide reassuring explanations for disturbing reports, regardless of whether those explanations were scientifically adequate. The project's staff began to include more public relations specialists and fewer technical analysts, reflecting its evolution from research operation to information management system. Captain Ruppelt himself found his position increasingly constrained by the new approach. His commitment to scientific methodology conflicted with the institutional pressure to minimize the significance of UFO reports, creating tensions that made his continued leadership problematic. The methodical investigation procedures he had established were gradually abandoned in favor of more expedient approaches that prioritized rapid case closure over thorough analysis. The case files themselves began to reflect this change in philosophy. The detailed reports that had characterized the early Bluebook period gave way to shorter, more formulaic documents that focused on providing conventional explanations rather than preserving evidence that might be relevant to future analysis. Witness interviews became briefer and more leading, designed to elicit information that supported conventional explanations rather than to document the full range of witness observations. The treatment of radar evidence exemplified this transformation. The Washington incidents had demonstrated the potential significance of multiple radar confirmations of visual sightings, but such complex evidence was difficult to explain away through simple conventional means. Consequently, radar returns that might have been subjected to detailed technical analysis during the Ruppelt period were increasingly attributed to equipment malfunctions, atmospheric anomalies, or operator error without the kind of thorough investigation that might have revealed the inadequacy of such explanations. The project's relationship with other government agencies also changed during this period. The close cooperation with scientific institutions that had characterized Ruppelt's approach was gradually reduced, as external analysis might produce conclusions that conflicted with the project's new emphasis on providing conventional explanations. The Battelle Memorial Institute study, which had been commissioned to provide independent statistical analysis of UFO cases, was completed during this transition period, but its conclusions were received with less enthusiasm than might have been expected given the thoroughness of the analysis. The quality of field investigations declined correspondingly. The detailed site visits and witness interviews that had been standard procedure during the early Bluebook period were increasingly replaced by telephone, conversations, and mail correspondence. Physical evidence was less likely to be collected and analyzed, while photographic materials were often evaluated without the technical resources that might have provided definitive conclusions about their nature and origin. The impact of these changes extended beyond individual case investigations to affect the project's overall approach to pattern recognition and hypothesis development. The systematic analysis of sighting reports that might have revealed geographic, temporal, or behavioral patterns was de-emphasized in favor of case-by-case explanations that avoided broader theoretical implications. The possibility that UFO reports might represent a coherent phenomenon worthy of scientific study was gradually replaced by the assumption that each report could be individually explained through conventional means. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who continued to serve as the project's astronomical consultant throughout this period, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His growing recognition that some UFO cases genuinely resisted conventional explanation conflicted with the project's new emphasis on providing such explanations regardless of their adequacy. The astronomer began to document his concerns about the quality of Bluebook investigations, creating a parallel record that would later provide insight into the tensions between scientific methodology and institutional priorities. The transformation of Project Bluebook during this period represented more than just a change in investigative procedures. It reflected a fundamental shift in the government's relationship with the UFO phenomenon. The brief period of genuine scientific inquiry that had characterized Ruppelt's leadership gave way to a more strategic approach that prioritized public reassurance over objective analysis. The mystery of unidentified flying objects was no longer treated as a scientific puzzle to be solved, but rather as a public relations problem to be managed. The offices where this transformation took place maintained their institutional appearance, but the work conducted within them had fundamentally changed character. The systematic pursuit of understanding that had once animated these spaces was gradually replaced by the mechanical application of predetermined explanations, creating an atmosphere of bureaucratic routine rather than scientific discovery. The questions that had originally sparked the creation of Project Bluebook remained unanswered, but they were no longer being actively pursued through the methodical investigation that such questions demanded. As the 1950s progressed, this transformed Project Bluebook would encounter cases that would test the limits of its new approach, challenging the assumption that all UFO reports could be adequately explained through conventional means. The institutional commitment to providing reassuring explanations would collide with evidence that resisted easy categorization, creating tensions that would ultimately contribute to the project's evolution toward its final form as a mechanism for managing public perception rather than advancing scientific understanding. I remember the quiet university offices where Dr. J. Allen Hynek spent those contemplative years of the late 1950s, surrounded by star charts and astronomical calculations that seemed to offer the comforting predictability that his work with Project Bluebook increasingly lacked. The Northwestern University Astronomy Department occupied a collection of brick buildings where the afternoon light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like distant celestial objects viewed through a telescope. The familiar sense of chalk dust and aging books created an atmosphere of scholarly routine that stood in sharp contrast to the growing uncertainty that had begun to characterize Hynek's relationship with the Air Force's UFO investigation. Hynek had entered his role as Project Bluebook's astronomical consultant with the confident skepticism that characterized academic science of the era. His initial assumption was that virtually all UFO sightings could be explained through misidentification of conventional astronomical objects, stars, planets, meteors, and atmospheric phenomena that untrained observers might mistake for something more exotic. This expectation had been reinforced by his early cases, many of which did indeed prove to involve the misidentification of Venus, bright stars, or unusual cloud formations. The astronomer's office at Northwestern was furnished with the accumulated tools of his profession-detailed star charts that covered every section of the night sky, ephemeris tables that predicted the positions of planets and bright stars throughout the year, and reference works that catalogued every known type of astronomical phenomenon. These materials had been sufficient for the majority of cases that came to his attention during the early years of his consultation, but as the years passed and the volume of cases grew, Hynek began to encounter reports that resisted easy astronomical explanation. These were not the casual observations of untrained civilians who might mistake Venus for a spacecraft, but detailed accounts from military pilots, air traffic controllers, and other professionals whose expertise and credibility were difficult to dismiss. The witnesses described objects that moved in ways that no known astronomical phenomenon could account for, displaying apparent intelligence and controlled flight characteristics that transcended the predictable motions of celestial bodies. The transformation of Hynek's perspective was gradual and reluctant, proceeding through stages that reflected his scientific training and natural skepticism. Initially, he approached each puzzling case with the assumption that more careful analysis would reveal a conventional explanation. He would calculate the positions of bright planets, check for unusual atmospheric conditions, and consult historical records of meteor showers or other transient astronomical events that might account for unusual sightings. The filing cabinets in Hynek's university office began to accumulate copies of the most perplexing Bluebook cases, reports that had been officially closed with conventional explanations that the astronomer found increasingly inadequate. These files represented a parallel investigation that Hynek conducted alongside his official consulting role, a more thorough analysis of cases that deserved better treatment than they had received from the Air Force's increasingly perfunctory approach. The Texas incidents of November 1957 provided a particularly significant challenge to Hynek's evolving understanding. Multiple witnesses reported that their automobile engines had stopped functioning when they encountered strange lights along rural highways near the town. The official Bluebook explanation attributed the reports to ball lightning, a rare but documented atmospheric phenomenon that could theoretically interfere with electrical systems. Hynek's independent analysis of the Leveland cases revealed the inadequacy of the ball lightning explanation. The sightings had occurred over a period of several hours and across a geographic area of several square miles, conditions that were inconsistent with the brief, localized nature of ball lightning. Moreover, the witnesses described structured objects with distinct shapes and controlled movements, characteristics that bore little resemblance to the chaotic, unpredictable behavior typical of atmospheric electrical phenomena. The astronomer's growing discomfort with Bluebook's explanatory methods was compounded by his direct experience with the project's changing investigative procedures. The thorough, case-by-case analysis that had characterized the Ruppelt era was being replaced by more standardized approaches that emphasized rapid closure over careful investigation. Hynek found himself being asked to provide astronomical explanations for cases that had not been adequately investigated, creating pressure to offer speculative interpretations rather than honest acknowledgments of insufficient data. The university environment in which Hynek worked provided both intellectual freedom and professional constraints that shaped his evolving relationship with the UFO phenomenon. As an established academic astronomer, he possessed the scientific credibility necessary to challenge official explanations and the institutional independence to pursue research that might conflict with government policy. However, his ongoing relationship with the Air Force created professional obligations that limited how publicly he could express his growing doubts about the adequacy of conventional UFO explanations. The lecture halls where Hynek taught undergraduate astronomy courses became inadvertent laboratories for his evolving understanding of the UFO phenomenon. Students who learned of his consulting role with Project Bluebook would often ask questions about flying saucers, creating opportunities for the professor to articulate his developing thoughts about the relationship between scientific methodology and unexplained phenomena. These informal discussions helped clarify Hynek's recognition that genuine scientific inquiry required honest acknowledgement of the limits of current knowledge, rather than forced explanations that preserved theoretical comfort at the expense of empirical accuracy. The correspondence files in Hynek's office began to fill with letters from other scientists who had encountered UFO reports in their professional capacities, physicists working at research installations, meteorologists who had observed unusual atmospheric phenomena, and engineers involved in military aircraft. Development shared accounts that suggested the UFO phenomenon extended far beyond the isolated reports that reached public attention. This informal network of scientific observers provided Hynek with a broader perspective on the phenomenon than was available through official Bluebook channels. The treatise that Hynek began drafting during this period represented his attempt to reconcile his scientific training with the evidence that was accumulating in his private files. This document, which would never be completed or published during the Bluebook era, outlined a more rigorous approach to UFO investigation that emphasized careful data collection, thorough analysis of witness credibility, and honest acknowledgement of cases that resisted conventional explanation. The treatise represented Hynek's vision of what UFO investigation could become if freed from the institutional pressures that constrained Project Bluebook. The travel that Hynek's consulting role required provided opportunities to interview witnesses and examine evidence firsthand, experiences that often revealed the inadequacy of the written reports that formed the basis of official Bluebook analysis. Meeting credible witnesses face to face, examining physical evidence in its original context, and conducting detailed site investigations gave the astronomer insights that were unavailable through the abbreviated procedures that had become standard for the project. The Red Bluff, California incident of August 1960 represented a particularly significant challenge to Hynek's evolving understanding. 2 California Highway Patrol officers reported a detailed encounter with a large, structured object that appeared to respond intelligently to their presence. The official Bluebook explanation attributed the sighting to a refueling operation involving military aircraft, but Hynek's investigation revealed that no such operations had been conducted in the area at the time of the incident. The astronomer's analysis of the Red Bluff case exemplified his increasingly rigorous approach to UFO investigation. Rather than accepting the first conventional explanation that could be proposed, Hynek conducted detailed checks of military flight operations, astronomical conditions, and meteorological factors that might have influenced the witnesses' observations. This thorough analysis revealed not only the inadequacy of the official explanation, but also the quality and credibility of the witness testimony. That Project Bluebook had dismissed too readily the academic calendar that governed Hynek's university responsibilities, created natural periods for reflection and analysis that were unavailable to the full-time Bluebook staff. During summer breaks and sabbatical periods, the astronomer could devote extended attention to the most puzzling cases in his files, conducting the kind of comprehensive analysis that the project's operational demands made impossible. These intensive study periods contributed to his growing recognition that the UFO phenomenon deserved more serious scientific attention than it was receiving. The scientific instruments available at Northwestern University's astronomy department provided resources that complemented the more limited analytical capabilities of Project Bluebook. Photographic analysis equipment, atmospheric monitoring devices, and computational resources allowed Hynek to conduct independent verification of official explanations and to pursue alternative hypotheses that might account for unexplained sightings. This technical capability gave the astronomer confidence in challenging Bluebook conclusions that seemed inadequately supported by evidence. The professional conferences that Hynek attended as part of his academic career created opportunities to discuss UFO cases with other scientists in informal settings, where institutional constraints were relaxed. Conversations with colleagues in physics, atmospheric science, and related fields revealed that the UFO phenomenon was generating interest and concern within the broader scientific community, even though this interest was rarely expressed in official forums or published research. As the 1950s gave way to the early 1960s, Hynek found himself occupying an increasingly uncomfortable position between his role as Project Bluebook's scientific consultant and his growing conviction that the phenomenon deserved more serious investigation than the Air Force was prepared to undertake. The cases accumulating in his private files represented evidence for anomalous phenomena that challenged conventional understanding, but his official obligations required him to provide conventional explanations that he privately recognized as inadequate. The tension between scientific integrity and institutional loyalty that characterized Hynek's situation during this period reflected broader challenges facing scientists, whose research intersected with classified government programs or politically sensitive topics. The astronomer's experience with Project Bluebook was teaching him that the pursuit of scientific truth sometimes conflicted with the administrative and political needs of the institutions that funded and directed scientific research. The quiet university offices where Hynek conducted his parallel investigation of the UFO phenomenon became repositories for evidence and analysis that existed outside the official channels of Project Bluebook. In filing cabinets and desk drawers, accumulating data that told a different story than the one being presented in official reports. A story that suggested the presence of genuinely anomalous phenomena that deserved careful scientific study rather than bureaucratic dismissal. This alternative archive would eventually provide the foundation for Hynek's post-Blue Book career as an advocate for serious scientific investigation of UFO reports. I remember the peculiar atmosphere that hung over the American Southwest during those years when the desert sky served simultaneously as a testing ground for humanity's most advanced aircraft and a stage for encounters that seemed to transcend human capability entirely. The air above places like Area 51 and Edwards Air Force Base shimmered with more than just heat mirages, carried the weight of classified programs whose very existence was known only to those with the highest security clearances, and whose operational realities created a maze of official deception that would entangle Project Bluebook in ways its investigators could never have anticipated. The Lockheed U-2 spy plane began its clandestine flights in 1956, climbing to altitudes that placed it far above the operational ceiling of any known aircraft. From the ground, particularly during the golden hours of dawn and dusk, when atmospheric conditions created optimal visibility, the U-2 appeared as a brilliant point of light moving across the sky at impossible heights. The aircraft's aluminum skin reflected sunlight in ways that made it visible long after conventional aircraft would have disappeared into the atmospheric haze, creating sightings that seemed to defy the basic principles of aviation. The U-2's flight characteristics were unlike anything in the civilian or acknowledged military inventory. It cruised at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, moving at speeds that appeared modest to ground observers, but represented cutting-edge performance for aircraft of that era. Most significantly, It operated according to flight patterns that bore no resemblance to commercial aviation or routine military exercises. The spy plane followed routes dictated by intelligence requirements rather than aeronautical convenience, appearing over locations and at times that seemed random to observers unaware of its classified mission. Project Bluebook investigators found themselves in the impossible position of having to explain sightings that were generated by aircraft whose existence they were not authorized to acknowledge. The solution that emerged was a systematic program of cover stories that attributed you to sightings to conventional phenomena, weather balloons, temperature inversions, astronomical objects, or equipment malfunctions. These explanations were often scientifically implausible, but they served the essential purpose of protecting classified information, while providing some form of official response to witness reports. The filing cabinets at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base began to fill with cases that represented layers of deception nested within layers of truth. A rancher in Nevada might report seeing a metallic object moving at impossible altitude across the morning sky. The official Bluebook investigation would attribute his sighting to a weather balloon or atmospheric phenomenon, while the classified addendum to the file, if such an addendum existed, might acknowledge that the witness had actually observed a U-2 on a reconnaissance mission over the Soviet Union. The psychological impact of this systematic deception on Bluebook personnel was profound and largely undocumented. Investigators who had been trained to seek truth through careful analysis found themselves required to promulgate explanations they knew to be false. The institutional pressure to maintain security classifications overrode the scientific methodology that had originally justified the project's existence, creating a form of cognitive dissonance that affected everyone involved in the investigation. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, whose role as astronomical consultant required him to provide scientific explanations for sightings that he increasingly suspected were not astronomical in nature, found himself caught between competing obligations. His scientific integrity demanded honest analysis of evidence, but his security clearances bound him to protect classified information that might compromise national security if disclosed. The astronomer's private files began to include cases where he suspected the true explanation was classified aircraft testing, but where his official reports were required to offer conventional astronomical interpretations. The Oxcart program, which developed the Lockheed A-12 reconnaissance aircraft, created even more complex problems for UFO investigators. The A-12's revolutionary design included features that made it appear genuinely alien to observers unfamiliar with advanced aviation technology. Its triangular profile, unusual engine configuration, and exotic materials created visual signatures that bore little resemblance to conventional aircraft. When test flights began in the early 1960s, the A-12 generated UFO reports that challenged even the most creative conventional explanations. The Nevada test site became a focal point for UFO sightings that reflected the convergence of multiple classified programs. Nuclear weapons testing created unusual atmospheric phenomena. Experimental aircraft generated unconventional flight signatures, and the general secrecy surrounding the facility created an environment where conventional explanations were often impossible to verify or refute. Project Bluebook investigators approaching cases from this region found themselves navigating a landscape where nearly everything was classified, and where official denials might conceal activities rather than confirm their absence. The coordination required between Bluebook investigators and the agencies responsible for classified aircraft programs created informal networks of information sharing that existed outside official channels. Intelligence officers who were aware of classified flight schedules could sometimes provide Bluebook personnel with general guidance about cases that might involve misidentification of experimental aircraft. But this information could not be documented in official reports or shared with witnesses, who deserved more honest explanations for their experiences. The irony of this situation was not lost on the more perceptive Bluebook personnel, who recognized that the government's legitimate need to protect classified programs was creating the very conditions that fueled conspiracy theories about UFO cover-ups, by providing false explanations for sightings that had conventional but classified explanations. The Air Force was teaching the public to distrust official statements about unidentified aerial phenomena. This distrust would later extend to cases where official explanations were honest and accurate, creating a climate of suspicion that served no one's interests. The technological capabilities being demonstrated by classified aircraft programs during this period were so advanced that they challenged the basic assumptions about what was possible within the realm of human engineering. The U-2's operational altitude exceeded the performance envelope of any acknowledged aircraft, while the A-12's speed and stealth characteristics seemed to transcend the limitations that constrained conventional aviation. For witnesses unfamiliar with these classified capabilities, encounters with test aircraft could reasonably be interpreted as evidence of technology that exceeded human achievement. The geographic concentration of UFO sightings around classified military installations created patterns that were obvious to anyone conducting systematic analysis of report locations. Nevada, California, and New Mexico states that hosted the most sensitive military research and testing facilities generated disproportionate numbers of UFO reports, particularly during periods of intense classified aircraft testing. These correlations were noted by Bluebook analysts, but could not be publicly acknowledged without compromising the security of the programs that generated them. The temporal correlations between UFO sightings and classified flight operations were even more revealing to those with access to both sets of data. Spikes in UFO reports often coincided with intensive test programs or operational missions, creating statistical relationships that would have provided definitive explanations. For many cases, if the underlying classified information could have been disclosed, the inability to acknowledge these correlations forced Bluebook investigators to offer alternative explanations that often seemed forced or inadequate to outside observers. The development of increasingly sophisticated surveillance and reconnaissance systems during this period created new categories of classified aircraft that generated their own unique types of UFO reports. Drone aircraft, high-altitude observation platforms, and experimental propulsion systems all contributed to the growing catalogue of unusual aerial phenomena that could not be publicly acknowledged or adequately explained through conventional means. The training programs for pilots and crew members of classified aircraft included briefings on how to respond to civilian UFO reports that might be generated by their operations. These briefings emphasized the importance of maintaining operational security, while acknowledging that test flights would inevitably generate sightings by civilian witnesses. The guidance provided to military personnel reflected the complex balance between security requirements and the need to avoid creating unnecessary public suspicion about government activities. The Bluebook staff, who were cleared for information about classified aircraft programs, found themselves occupying a unique and uncomfortable position within the investigation. They possessed knowledge that could explain many of the most puzzling UFO reports, but they were prohibited from using this knowledge in their official investigations or public statements. This created a form of intellectual frustration that was compounded by the recognition that their silence was contributing to public distrust of government institutions. The media coverage of UFO incidents during this period reflected the complex interplay between public curiosity, government secrecy, and the limits of available information. Journalists investigating UFO reports often encountered official denials and conventional explanations that seemed inadequate, but they lacked access to the classified information that might have provided more satisfactory answers. This information asymmetry created conditions where speculation and conspiracy theories flourished in the absence of verifiable facts. The scientific community's relationship with UFO phenomena was complicated by the knowledge that some sightings might involve classified technology that exceeded publicly acknowledged capabilities. Scientists who might otherwise have been skeptical about claims of advanced aerial technology were aware that significant resources were being devoted to classified aerospace research, whose results were not available for public evaluation. This awareness created uncertainty about what was possible within the realm of classified programs and what might represent genuinely anomalous phenomena. As the 1960s progressed, the accumulation of UFO reports that were secretly attributable to classified aircraft testing created a growing burden of institutional deception that affected everyone involved in the investigation. The systematic provision of false explanations for sightings that had conventional but classified causes was creating a foundation of public distrust that would ultimately undermine the credibility of all government statements about UFO phenomena, including those that were honest and accurate. The desert installations where much of this classified testing occurred became inadvertent laboratories for studying the relationship between advanced technology and public perception. The sightings generated by experimental aircraft provided insights into how witnesses interpreted encounters with unfamiliar technology, while the official responses to these sightings revealed the challenges of maintaining security while preserving public confidence in government institutions. In the quiet offices where Bluebook investigators processed reports that they knew contained partial truths and necessary deceptions, the weight of institutional secrecy settled like dust on filing cabinets that held stories that could never be completely told. I remember the subtle changes that began to appear in the correspondence files of Project Bluebook during those middle years of the 1960s, when the carefully maintained facade of bureaucratic competence started to develop hairline fractures that would eventually compromise the entire structure of official UFO investigation. The filing cabinets still closed with the same metallic snap. The typewriters still hammered out reports with mechanical precision, and the fluorescent lights continued to cast their familiar harsh glow over desks where investigators processed cases according to established procedures. But beneath this surface continuity, something fundamental was shifting. The Socorro, New Mexico incident of April 24, 1964, arrived at Project Bluebook in the form of a routine police report that would prove anything but routine in its implications for the investigation's credibility. Police Sergeant Lonnie Zamora, a respected law enforcement officer with 16 years of experience, had encountered something near the small desert town that challenged every assumption about what could be adequately explained through conventional means. Zamora's account described a detailed close encounter with a metallic, oval-shaped craft that bore strange symbols on its surface. The officer had observed the object at close range, heard unusual sounds, and witnessed what appeared to be humanoid figures near the craft before it departed with a roaring noise that left physical traces in the desert sand. The case contained precisely the elements that made Project Bluebook investigators uncomfortable: multiple types of evidence, a highly credible witness, and physical traces that could be independently verified. The investigation of the Socorro incident revealed the limitations of Bluebook's standardized approach to UFO reports. The case could not be dismissed as astronomical misidentification, whether balloon confusion or psychological delusion. Zamora was a trained observer whose professional competence was essential to law enforcement in his community, and his account was supported by physical evidence that could be photographed, measured, and analyzed. The incident demanded exactly the kind of thorough scientific investigation that Project Bluebook had been designed to conduct, but was no longer equipped or inclined to pursue. The physical evidence at the Socorro site included burn marks in the desert vegetation, impressions in the ground that appeared to have been made by landing supports, and traces of unusual material that did not match any known substances from conventional aircraft or military equipment. This evidence was documented by multiple investigators, including representatives from Project Bluebook, but the analysis was cursory and the conclusions were inconclusive. The case was eventually classified as unidentified, a designation that satisfied neither skeptics who demanded conventional explanations nor researchers who believed the evidence warranted more thorough study. Dr. J. Allen Hynek's involvement in the Socorro investigation marked a significant moment in his evolving relationship with Project Bluebook. The astronomer's site visit revealed physical evidence and witness testimony that could not be adequately addressed through the abbreviated procedures that had become standard for the project. His growing frustration with the quality of Bluebook investigations found expression in private correspondence with colleagues, creating a parallel record of scientific dissent that would eventually become public knowledge. The news media's coverage of the Socorro incident reflected the broader cultural shift that was occurring in American attitudes toward government authority and official explanations. The 1960s had ushered in an era of increased skepticism about institutional claims, and UFO investigations were not immune to this changing climate. Journalists began to ask more probing questions about the adequacy of Bluebook explanations, and some began to investigate cases independently rather than simply accepting official conclusions. The congressional attention that UFO investigations began to receive during this period created new pressures on Project Bluebook that the project was not designed to handle. Representative Gerald Ford of Michigan, responding to constituent concerns about UFO sightings in his state, called for congressional hearings on the Air Force's handling of UFO reports. This political interest transformed what had been primarily a military and scientific matter into a public policy issue that required different types of responses and justifications. The House Armed Services Committee hearings held in April 1966 represented the first formal congressional examination of Project Bluebook since its inception. The testimony presented by Air Force officials emphasized the project's success in providing conventional explanations for UFO reports, but the questioning from committee members revealed gaps between official claims and the actual quality of the investigations. The hearings created a permanent public record of Bluebook procedures and conclusions that could be scrutinized by researchers and critics. Secretary of the Air Force Harold Brown's testimony during the congressional hearings outlined the official position that UFO investigations had found no evidence of threats to national security or advanced technology beyond current human capabilities. This testimony was technically accurate based on the project's official findings, but it did not address the growing concerns about the quality of the investigations that produced those findings or the adequacy of the procedures used to reach those conclusions. The Exeter, New Hampshire incidents of September 1965 provided another challenge to Bluebook's explanatory capabilities. Multiple witnesses, including police officers, reported detailed encounters with large, structured objects that displayed unusual lighting patterns and flight characteristics. The official explanation attributed the sightings to military aircraft conducting training exercises, but independent investigation revealed that no such exercises had been conducted in the area at the times of the reported incidents. The pattern of inadequate explanations followed by independent verification of their inadequacy was becoming increasingly common during this period. Journalists, scientists, and private researchers began to conduct their own investigations of UFO cases, often uncovering evidence that contradicted or undermined the official Bluebook conclusions. This parallel investigation network created a form of accountability that Project Bluebook had not previously faced, exposing the shortcomings of its abbreviated procedures and predetermined conclusions. The personnel changes that occurred within Project Bluebook during this period reflected the project's evolution from scientific investigation to administrative processing. Major Hector Quintanilla, who replaced Captain Ruppelt as project director, brought a different philosophy to the position. Where Ruppelt had emphasized thorough investigation and honest analysis, Quintanilla seemed more concerned with efficient case closure and public relations management. The change in leadership style was reflected in the quality of investigations and the nature of the explanations provided for puzzling cases. The institutional pressures that Project Bluebook faced during this period were complex and sometimes contradictory. Congressional interest demanded evidence of thorough investigation and scientific competence, while security considerations required continued protection of classified information that might explain some UFO sightings. The need to maintain public confidence in government institutions conflicted with the obligation to provide honest assessments of genuinely puzzling phenomena. These competing demands created an operational environment where success was difficult to define and nearly impossible to achieve. The relationship between Project Bluebook and the broader scientific community began to deteriorate during this period as evidence accumulated that the project was not conducting the kind of rigorous investigation that its mission statement suggested. Scientists who had initially supported the Air Force's approach to UFO investigation became increasingly critical of the quality of analysis and the adequacy of explanations. This scientific criticism was particularly damaging because it came from within the same technical community that the Air Force relied upon for credibility in other areas of research and development. The internal documents that circulated within Project Bluebook during this period revealed the growing tension between the project's official mission and its operational realities. Memoranda discussing case investigation procedures acknowledged the limitations of current methods while expressing frustration with the institutional constraints that prevented more thorough analysis. These documents, some of which would later be released through Freedom of Information Act requests, provided insight into the internal struggles that characterized the project's final years. The technological context of UFO sightings was becoming increasingly complex during this period as military and civilian aviation capabilities continued to advance rapidly. The proliferation of experimental aircraft, satellite launches, and atmospheric research programs created new categories of conventional phenomena that might be misidentified as UFOs. However, this expanding range of conventional explanations was offset by the improving quality of witness testimony and evidence documentation, making it more difficult to dismiss credible reports through superficial analysis. The photographic evidence that Project Bluebook evaluated during this period included some of the most compelling visual documentation of unexplained aerial phenomena that had ever been submitted for official analysis. The McMinnville, Oregon photographs, the Trinidad Island images, and other visual materials presented challenges that the project's analytical capabilities were not adequate to address. The tendency to dismiss photographic evidence as hoaxes or misidentifications without thorough technical analysis became increasingly controversial as independent experts began to conduct their own evaluations. The geographic patterns of UFO sightings during this period continued to show concentrations around military installations and areas of sensitive government activity. But these correlations were not being systematically analyzed or publicly acknowledged. The failure to investigate these patterns represented a missed opportunity to understand the relationship between UFO reports and military operations, whether that relationship involved misidentification of classified aircraft or genuine, anomalous phenomena that were attracted to areas of technological activity. The international dimension of UFO investigations was becoming increasingly important during this period as other nations developed their own approaches to analyzing unexplained aerial phenomena. The British, Canadian, and French governments were conducting investigations that often employed more rigorous scientific methods than Project Bluebook, creating unfavorable comparisons that reflected poorly on the American approach. The existence of these international investigations also provided alternative sources of information and analysis that could be used to evaluate the adequacy of American conclusions. As 1966 drew to a close, Project Bluebook found itself facing challenges that its original design had not anticipated and for which its current procedures were inadequate. The accumulation of unexplained cases, the erosion of scientific credibility, and the increasing public and political scrutiny all pointed toward the need for fundamental changes in approach or mission. The cracks that had appeared in the system were widening, and the institutional foundations that had supported nearly 2 decades of UFO investigation were beginning to show signs of structural failure that would soon require dramatic remedial action or complete reconstruction. I remember the quiet corridors of the University of Colorado during those autumn months of 1966, when the afternoon light filtered through tall academic windows and cast long shadows across polished floors that had witnessed decades of scholarly inquiry. The air carried the familiar sense of aging books and chalk dust, creating an atmosphere of contemplative research that seemed far removed from the political pressures and institutional conflicts that had prompted this final, comprehensive study of unidentified flying objects. Dr. Edward U. Condon's office occupied a corner of the physics cells building, where the distant sounds of student conversations and laboratory work provided a backdrop of academic normalcy to what would prove to be the most controversial UFO investigation in American history. The contract that brought the University of Colorado into the UFO investigation had been negotiated through channels that reflected both the Air Force's desire for scientific credibility and the academic community's need for research independence. The arrangement called for an 18-month study that would examine the accumulated evidence from nearly 2 decades of official UFO investigations, evaluate the scientific merit of continued research into unexplained aerial phenomena, and provide recommendations about the future direction of government involvement in such studies. Condon himself brought impressive scientific credentials to the assignment. His work in atomic and molecular physics had established him as one of the leading experimental scientists of his generation, while his involvement in the Manhattan Project and other classified research programs had given him experience with the intersection of scientific inquiry and national security concerns. The physicist's reputation for analytical rigor and intellectual honesty made him an ideal choice to lead what was intended to be the definitive scientific evaluation of the UFO phenomenon. The university environment in which the Colorado UFO Project operated provided both advantages and constraints that would profoundly influence its conclusions. The academic setting offered intellectual freedom from the institutional pressures that had compromised previous Air Force investigations, allowing researchers to follow evidence wherever it might lead without regard for military or political considerations. However, this same academic environment also carried expectations about the nature of acceptable scientific conclusions, creating subtle pressures that favored conventional explanations over more speculative possibilities. The staff assembled for the Colorado study represented diverse scientific disciplines and investigative approaches. Atmospheric physicists, astronomers, psychologists, and engineers brought their specialized expertise to the analysis of UFO cases, while investigative personnel with backgrounds in both military and civilian analysis provided the practical skills necessary for thorough field work. This multidisciplinary approach promised to bring unprecedented scientific rigor to questions that had previously been addressed through more limited analytical frameworks. The case files that arrived from Project Bluebook filled numerous filing cabinets and represented the accumulated documentation of 20 years of official UFO investigation. These materials included not only the reports and conclusions that had been made public, but also the internal memoranda, witness interviews, and technical analyses that revealed the actual quality of the investigations that produced those conclusions. The university researchers found themselves confronting evidence that often contradicted the confident explanations that had been offered in official Bluebook reports. Dr. Roy Craig, the project's principal field investigator, approached the most significant UFO cases with the methodical attention that characterized serious scientific research. His investigations of incidents like the Exeter sightings and the Ravenna, Ohio encounter revealed patterns of official inadequacy that extended far beyond simple investigative oversight. The fieldwork conducted by the Colorado team often uncovered witness testimony and physical evidence that had been ignored or inadequately analyzed by previous investigations, creating a more complex picture of the UFO phenomenon than official summaries had suggested. The university library, where much of the analytical work was conducted, became a repository for materials that had never been subjected to comprehensive scholarly examination. Technical reports from military contractors, classified memoranda that had been declassified for the study, and scientific papers from international researchers provided context that had been unavailable to previous investigations. The accumulated weight of this documentation began to reveal patterns and correlations that challenged some of the fundamental assumptions that had guided earlier UFO research. The psychological studies conducted as part of the Colorado investigation provided new insights into the human factors that influenced UFO reports, rather than simply dismissing witnesses as unreliable or delusional. The university researchers conducted detailed psychological evaluations that revealed the complexity of factors affecting observational accuracy and reporting reliability. These studies suggested that while psychological factors did influence UFO reports, they could not account for all aspects of the phenomenon, particularly cases involving multiple independent witnesses and supporting physical evidence. The statistical analyses performed by the Colorado team represented the most sophisticated mathematical examination of UFO data that had ever been attempted. Computer-assisted studies of sighting patterns, witness demographics, and seasonal variations revealed correlations that had been missed by previous investigations. Some of these correlations supported conventional explanations for UFO reports, while others suggested the presence of genuine anomalies that warranted continued scientific attention. The internal dynamics of the Colorado UFO project began to reflect tensions that had characterized earlier investigations. Some team members approached their work with the assumption that thorough scientific analysis would reveal conventional explanations for virtually all UFO reports, while others maintained greater openness to the possibility that some cases might represent genuinely anomalous phenomena. These philosophical differences influenced both the conduct of investigations and the interpretation of evidence, creating divisions within the research team that would ultimately affect the project's conclusions. The classified briefings that project staff received about military activities and experimental aircraft programs provided context that had been unavailable to civilian UFO researchers. Knowledge of U-2 flights, experimental missile tests, and atmospheric research programs allowed the Colorado team to explain some historical UFO cases that had previously remained mysterious. However, this classified information also revealed the extent to which official UFO explanations had been deliberately misleading, even when conventional explanations were available but could not be disclosed for security reasons. Dr. David Saunders, one of the project's principal investigators, began to document concerns about the direction and methodology of the Colorado study. His private correspondence with colleagues revealed growing frustration with what he perceived as predetermined conclusions that were not adequately supported by the evidence being gathered through field investigations. These concerns would eventually lead to internal conflicts that threatened the project's credibility and scientific objectivity. The media attention that surrounded the Colorado UFO project created pressures that academic researchers rarely encountered in their normal scholarly work. Journalists sought regular updates on the study's progress, while UFO enthusiasts and skeptics both attempted to influence the investigation's direction. The need to maintain scientific objectivity while managing public expectations created challenges that tested the university's commitment to independent research. The interim reports and preliminary findings that emerged from the Colorado study began to reveal the complexity of conclusions that would characterize the final report. Some UFO cases were definitively explained through conventional means, while others remained genuinely puzzling despite thorough investigations. The distribution of explained versus unexplained cases did not conform to the simple patterns that either strong skeptics or ardent believers had expected, creating a nuanced picture that satisfied neither extreme position. The international perspective that the Colorado researchers brought to their analysis revealed that UFO phenomena were truly global in scope, with similar types of reports emerging from countries with vastly different cultural, military, and technological contexts. This cross-cultural consistency suggested that whatever factors were generating UFO reports operated independently of local, cultural, or institutional influences, pointing toward either universal human psychological tendencies or genuinely physical phenomena that transcended national boundaries. The technical analyses of photographic and physical evidence conducted by the Colorado team employed more sophisticated methods than had been available to previous investigations. Spectroscopic analysis, computer enhancement of images, and advanced metallurgical testing provided new insights into some of the most compelling UFO evidence. While some previously mysterious materials were identified as conventional substances, other samples continued to resist explanation through known analytical techniques. The relationship between the Colorado UFO project and the Air Force became increasingly strained as the study progressed and its findings began to diverge from official expectations. Military officials who had hoped for a definitive debunking of the UFO phenomenon found instead a more complex assessment that acknowledged both the reality of unexplained cases and the inadequacy of previous investigations. This tension created political pressures that threatened to compromise the study's independence and scientific integrity. The internal memoranda that circulated within the Colorado UFO project during its final months revealed the institutional pressures that shaped the study's conclusions. The trick memo, written by project coordinator Robert Lowe, acknowledged that the study needed to appear objective while reaching conclusions that would satisfy the Air Force's desire to terminate UFO investigations. The disclosure of this memo created a scandal that undermined the project's credibility and raised questions about the integrity of its scientific methodology. The dismissal of David Saunders and Norman Levine from the Colorado project reflected the internal conflicts that had been building throughout the study period. Their removal came after they publicly criticized the project's direction and methodology, arguing that evidence for genuinely anomalous phenomena was being suppressed or inadequately analyzed. The controversy surrounding their dismissal created additional scrutiny of the project's conclusions and methods. As the Colorado UFO project entered its final phase, the accumulated evidence painted a picture that was more complex than either ardent believers or committed skeptics had anticipated. The study had identified conventional explanations for many historical UFO cases, but it had also documented incidents that continued to resist explanation despite thorough investigation. The challenge facing Condon and his team was how to present these nuanced findings in a report that would satisfy the scientific community, the Air Force, and the interested public. The university offices, where the final report was being written during the winter of 1968, became the site of intense discussions about how to balance scientific honesty with institutional expectations. The evidence that had been gathered supported neither complete dismissal of the UFO phenomenon nor acceptance of extraordinary explanations, creating a middle ground that was difficult to articulate in terms that would satisfy the polarized constituencies that awaited the study's conclusions. The draft chapters that circulated among project staff revealed the internal tensions that would characterize the final report. Individual case studies often acknowledged the inadequacy of conventional explanations, while summary chapters emphasized the lack of evidence for extraordinary phenomena. This inconsistency reflected both the complexity of the evidence and the institutional pressures that influenced how that evidence was interpreted and presented. The scientific study of unidentified flying objects, as the final report was formally titled, represented nearly 1,500 pages of analysis, case studies, and conclusions that would effectively end official government involvement in UFO investigations. The report's recommendations against continued UFO research would be accepted by the Air Force and implemented through the termination of Project Blue and implemented through the termination of Project Blow, bringing to a plow within Twosinamon by Plown. In the manner there will be being came by and Billy by one more bull will with with the run out with I remember the particular quality of silence that settled over the Project Bluebook offices during those final weeks of December 1969, when the Ohio winter pressed against windows that would soon be dark for the last time, and the filing cabinets that had held America's strangest secrets were being prepared for their journey to the archives. The fluorescent lights hummed with the same frequency they had maintained for years, but their illumination now fell upon desks being cleared of personal items and walls being stripped of the charts and photographs that had once guided the search for answers in the sky. The official termination order had arrived through routine administrative channels, bearing the bureaucratic language that transforms institutional death into clerical procedure. Secretary of the Air Force Robert Siemens had signed the directive that would close Project Bluebook effective December 17, 1969. Accepting the Colorado study's recommendation that continued UFO investigation served no useful scientific or national security purpose. The 22-year effort to understand unidentified flying objects was ending not with revelation or resolution, but with the quiet efficiency of budget cuts and personnel reassignments. Major Hector Quintanilla, who had directed Project Bluebook through its final years, found himself in the peculiar position of presiding over the systematic dismantling of an investigation that had consumed decades of military resources and generated thousands of documented cases. The Major's office, which had been the nerve center for UFO investigations across the United States, was being reduced to its essential components: furniture that would be redistributed, equipment that would be reassigned, and files that would be transferred to the Air Force archives at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. The statistics that summarized Project Bluebook's official accomplishments were impressive in their comprehensiveness, if not in their resolution. Over the course of its existence, the project had investigated 12,618 UFO sightings, of which 11,917 had been classified as identified through conventional explanations. The remaining 701 cases retained their unidentified status, representing phenomena that had resisted explanation despite official investigation. These numbers would become the final accounting of America's longest-running scientific mystery, reduced to columns of data that revealed both the scope of the phenomenon and the limits of institutional inquiry. The process of transferring case files to the archives required careful attention to security, classifications, and access restrictions that would govern future research into the Bluebook materials. Documents that contained classified information about military operations, experimental aircraft, or intelligence sources required special handling and would remain restricted even after the project's termination. The bulk of the files, however, would eventually become available to researchers and historians, creating a documentary record that would support decades of non-governmental UFO research. The Ballender Memo, classified as secret and addressed to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, revealed the institutional reality that lay beneath the official termination of Project Bluebook. Brigadier General Carol Ballender acknowledged that UFO reports that suggested advanced technology or posed potential national security concerns would continue to be investigated through other channels even after the public termination of Bluebook. This memorandum, which would not be declassified until years later, demonstrated that the end of official UFO investigation was more apparent than real. The personnel who had staffed Project Bluebook during its final years faced the challenge of transitioning to new assignments that bore little resemblance to their UFO investigation experience. Intelligence analysts who had spent years evaluating witness reports and technical evidence found themselves assigned to more conventional military duties, carrying with them memories of cases that had never been adequately resolved and questions that would remain officially unanswered. Dr. J. Allen Hynek's relationship with the Air Force UFO investigation had evolved over more than 2 decades, from confident skepticism to frustrated recognition that some reported phenomena deserved more serious scientific attention than they were receiving. The astronomer's final consultation with Project Bluebook marked the end of his official involvement with government UFO research, but it also represented the beginning of his emergence as the most credible scientific advocate for continued investigation of unexplained aerial phenomena. The media coverage of Project Bluebook's termination reflected the complex public attitudes that had developed toward UFO investigation over more than 20 years of official inquiry. Some journalists reported the closure as evidence that the flying saucer mystery had been solved through rational analysis and scientific method, while others suggested that the termination represented an abandonment of legitimate scientific questions that deserved continued study. The diversity of media interpretations revealed the extent to which UFO investigation had become a cultural and political issue that transcended its scientific dimensions. The international implications of America's withdrawal from official UFO research created diplomatic and scientific complications that extended beyond national boundaries. Allied nations that had coordinated their UFO investigations with Project Bluebook found themselves without their primary source of technical cooperation and information sharing. The termination of Bluebook left other countries to pursue UFO research independently, potentially creating gaps in international cooperation that might affect mutual security interests. The unofficial networks of UFO researchers that had developed outside government channels during the Bluebook era suddenly found themselves inheriting primary responsibility for continued investigation of unexplained aerial phenomena. Organizations like the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, NICAP, and the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, had maintained parallel investigations throughout the official period, often conducting more thorough analysis of cases that Bluebook had closed with inadequate explanations. The archives that received the Project Bluebook files represented more than just a bureaucratic transfer of documents. They constituted the preservation of a unique chapter in the relationship between scientific inquiry and institutional authority. The thousands of case files, witness statements, photographic analyses, and internal memoranda would provide future researchers with unprecedented insight into how military and scientific institutions responded to phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. The cases that remained officially unidentified at the time of Bluebook's termination represented a particularly intriguing legacy of the investigation. These 701 incidents had survived the most systematic debunking effort in government history. Resisting explanation despite official pressure to provide conventional interpretations for all UFO reports, the persistence of these unexplained cases suggested either the inadequacy of investigative methods or the reality of phenomena that transcended current scientific understanding. The technological context that surrounded Project Bluebook's termination was dramatically different from the environment that had existed when the investigation began in the aftermath of Kenneth Arnold's 1947 sighting. Military aviation had evolved from propeller-driven aircraft to supersonic jets and space vehicles, while civilian technology had advanced to include commercial jet travel, satellite communications, and early computer systems. Yet, despite these technological advances, some UFO reports continued to describe capabilities that exceeded acknowledged human achievements. The space program's achievements during the 1960s provided new perspectives on both UFO sightings and the possibilities for advanced technology. Astronauts had observed unusual phenomena during their missions, while the technological capabilities demonstrated by space vehicles offered new benchmarks for evaluating claims about unusual aircraft performance. The contrast between known space technology and some UFO reports suggested either the existence of much more advanced human capabilities or the presence of non-human technology. The cultural impact of Project Bluebook's termination extended far beyond the immediate effects on UFO research. The end of official investigation coincided with a period of increasing public skepticism about government institutions. Influenced by the Vietnam War, Watergate, and other events that challenged faith in official statements, the termination of Bluebook became part of a broader narrative about government secrecy and the public's right to know about officially suppressed information. The scientific community's response to the end of official UFO investigation was mixed, reflecting the complex relationship between academic research and phenomena that challenged conventional understanding. Some scientists welcomed the termination as evidence that resources would no longer be wasted on investigations of questionable merit, while others worried that genuinely scientific questions were being abandoned for political rather than empirical reasons. The Freedom of Information Act, which had been signed into law in 1966, would eventually provide unprecedented public access to previously classified UFO documents. This legislation transformed the landscape of UFO research by allowing civilian investigators to obtain official documents that revealed the internal workings of government investigations. The FOIA requests that began arriving in the 1970s would expose inconsistencies between public statements and internal assessments that fueled continuing controversy about the adequacy of official UFO explanations. The Condon Report's recommendation against continued UFO research had been based on the conclusion that further investigation would be unlikely to contribute significantly to scientific knowledge. However, this assessment was controversial even within the scientific community, with critics arguing that the Colorado study had not adequately addressed the most compelling evidence for anomalous phenomena. The debate over the Condon Report's methodology and conclusions would continue long after Project Bluebook's termination. The personnel who had been involved in UFO investigation during the Bluebook era carried their experiences into other careers and contexts, creating an informal network of former investigators who maintained interest in the phenomenon despite the end of official research. These individuals, scattered throughout military, intelligence, and scientific institutions, would continue to encounter unexplained phenomena in their professional activities and would sometimes share information through unofficial channels. The foreign government investigations that continued after America's withdrawal from UFO research provided alternative sources of data and analysis that would influence future understanding of the phenomenon. Countries like France, Brazil, and the United Kingdom maintained or established official UFO research programs that employed different methodologies and reached different conclusions than American investigations. These international studies would eventually provide comparative perspectives that highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of the Bluebook approach. The transition from official to unofficial UFO research created new opportunities for scientific investigation free from the political and security constraints that had limited government studies. Academic researchers could now pursue UFO investigations without concern for national security implications or institutional political considerations, potentially leading to more objective analysis of the phenomenon. However, the loss of official funding and access to classified information also created new limitations that would affect the scope and quality of future research. As the last boxes of files were sealed and prepared for transfer to the archives, and the final reports were signed and submitted through proper channels, Project Bluebook entered history as both an achievement in systematic investigation and a demonstration of the limits of institutional inquiry when confronted with phenomena that resist conventional explanation. The lights that were switched off in those Ohio offices represented the end of America's official commitment to understanding unexplained aerial phenomena, but they also illuminated questions that would continue to challenge both scientific understanding and public curiosity. The keys that were turned in locks for the final time secured more than just empty offices. They marked the boundary between an era of official investigation and a future of independent inquiry, between institutional authority and public curiosity, between the comfort of bureaucratic closure and the persistence of unanswered questions. The end that wasn't an end had begun, and the mystery of unidentified flying objects would continue to evolve in new contexts and through new investigations, free from the constraints of official explanation, but also deprived of the resources that only governmental institutions could provide. In the gathering twilight of that December evening, as the last investigators departed the offices where America's strangest cases had been processed and filed, the questions that had started it all remained suspended in the winter air, waiting for new voices to ask them and new methods to pursue them. The end of Project Bluebook marked not the resolution of the UFO mystery, but rather its transformation from an institutional responsibility into a cultural inheritance that would be carried forward by anyone curious enough to look up at the sky and wonder what might be looking back. I remember now how this long journey through the archives began. In those quiet hours when the weight of institutional memory settles like dust on forgotten files, and the whispered secrets of government bureaucracy finally find their voice in the patient telling of history. Tonight, we close the book on Project Bluebook not because the mystery was solved, but because we have traced the human story of those who tried to solve it. The filing cabinets that once held 701 unexplained cases now rest in climate-controlled archives, their contents available to researchers who continue the work that Captain Ruppelt began with such methodical hope in 1952. The fluorescent lights that illuminated late-night investigations have long since been replaced, but the questions they illuminated persist in new forms, pursued through new methods, investigated by new generations of researchers who inherit both the wonder and the skepticism that defined this remarkable chapter in American institutional history. What we have witnessed is not a story about flying saucers or extraterrestrial visitation, but rather a chronicle of how human institutions respond when confronted with the genuinely unknown. We have seen scientific curiosity give way to bureaucratic convenience, watched methodical investigation transform into public relations management, and observed the tension between transparency and secrecy that characterizes democratic societies, grappling with mysteries that challenge comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality. The men and women who staffed these projects, from Kenneth Arnold's careful report to Major Quintanilla's final case closure, were products of their time and their institutions, doing their best to serve conflicting masters: scientific truth, national security, public confidence, and bureaucratic efficiency. Their legacy is not the answers they failed to find, but the careful documentation they left behind, the procedures they established, and the questions they preserved for future investigation. In the end, Project Bluebook succeeded not in explaining away the UFO phenomenon, but in demonstrating the limits of institutional inquiry when applied to phenomena that exist at the boundaries of current understanding. The project's true achievement was not its official conclusions, but its creation of an archive that would outlast its institutional sponsors, providing future researchers with the raw materials necessary to ask better questions than bureaucracy could accommodate. Tonight, somewhere in the darkness above us, aircraft follow routes planned by computers and guided by satellites, pursuing missions that would have seemed impossible to the investigators who once tracked mysterious lights across the night sky. Yet, the fundamental human impulse to look up and wonder what else might be sharing our atmospheric space remains unchanged, as does our responsibility to investigate such questions with the same methodical patience and scientific rigor that characterized Project Bluebook at its best. The story continues in new archives, new investigations, and new attempts to balance scientific curiosity with institutional necessity. The end that wasn't an end has become a beginning that acknowledges both the persistence of mystery and the persistence of the human desire to understand. In that persistence, perhaps lies the real lesson of Project Bluebook, not in what it proved or disproved, but in what it preserved for those who would continue looking up at the sky, wondering what might be looking back. Rest well, knowing that the questions endure, and that somewhere in quiet offices illuminated by the soft glow of computer screens, researchers continue the patient work of sifting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and maintaining the careful documentation that transforms mystery into history, one case file at a time.